This is the Armed Forces of Central Asia, a new miniseries examining the military and security forces of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. Wargaming is a fascinating tool.
If there was any risk that Russian troops were going to come under fire.
Some would allow you to get a better idea on the limitations and structural problems built into a number of militaries. And whilst it most certainly does have its drawbacks, after all, it's almost impossible to predict the exact outcome of every single battle, it does lay out the most likely scenarios these militaries are going to be faced with, and the very limited number of options they have available to them to deal with it. Now, obviously, this is just a part of a much larger project, with these war games done in much more detail and much more nuance in the corresponding sections of our larger 1,000-page report. But for this episode, we thought we'd sit down and take you through some of the results and give these militaries and their capabilities a bit of a road test. As for this part, we've interviewed and teamed up with a number of individuals, think tanks, government and military organizations to run a whole series of different scenarios and debate what the most likely outcome of each one would be. And again, whilst it's very difficult to pick the exact events or how gallantly the soldiers will fight, what you can pull from exercises like this are all the other key indicators, like the likely impact of a country not having anywhere near enough field trucks to be able to keep more than a couple of brigades going at a time, or the limitations imposed when your enemy drone program can strike your airfields, but your drone program can't strike theirs. Or simply just examining the geographic bottlenecks built into these countries that force the attacker to only take one set of options, and it's not a good set of options. Now, in the first episode of this mini-series, also called The Armed Forces of Central Asia, we took a closer look at the nation of Tajikistan, unpacking its military structure, how each of its various branches works, as well as some of its weaknesses and shortfalls, many of which honestly exist in other Central Asian republics as well. And if you haven't checked that out, we either recommend listening to that one first or checking that one out directly after this one, both of which you can find in the description below. As for the second piece, we're going to be jumping straight into the wargaming results and giving you a full analysis of 3 key scenarios. The first scenario examining an invasion of Kyrgyzstan by Tajikistan, 2 nations that have clashed with one another as recently as 2022 and have been engaging in a regional arms race ever since. From there, we'll be going to our second scenario, which examines Uzbekistan carrying out a full-scale invasion of Tajikistan, effectively examining a scenario where the largest military in Central Asia carries out an invasion of the smallest military, and how what you think the outcome might be on paper is pretty different to the reality when you start really getting into the nuts and bolts of things, with geography, logistics, and regional politics still being the predominant deciders of how these conflicts go. And our third and final scenario here will be unpacking the one I probably get asked about the most, that being a potential invasion of northern Kazakhstan by Russia. As particularly since 2022, there's been more and more language coming out of the Russian Duma that mirrors the same sort of precursors that Russia used before its invasion of the Donbass in 2014. So we sat down and took a look at what the likely outcome would be if Russia chose to pull that trigger. And what we found was far more complicated than we were expecting. The point being that each of these 3 scenarios can tell us a whole lot about the capabilities and difficulties built into these military structures. And regardless of luck, how difficult conducting this war would really be. So let's start off by diving into our first scenario, an invasion of southern Kyrgyzstan by the Tajik armed forces. And to help us unpack these pretty complicated war games, as well as the logistics that follow it, we turn to our special guest.
Part 1. The Battle for Batken, a Tajik invasion of Kyrgyzstan.
Now, for part 1 of this analysis, we're going to start by focusing on the 2 smallest of the Central Asian republics, them being Tajikistan, the nation we went into in great detail with the last episode, and the other being Kyrgyzstan, its neighbor to the north. Now, when strictly looking at these countries militarily, the 2 actually have a lot in common. Both nations are heavily reliant on Russia to supply them with military equipment. Both nations' armored forces are still primarily made up of old Soviet vehicles and platforms. Both nations share a command and control structure that's fairly similar. And both nations are also a part of the Russian-led security alliance, the CSTO. Where you'll find the major differences between these 2 is instead in culture and governance. With Kyrgyzstan, up until just a few years ago, often being referred to by outsiders as the island of democracy in Central Asia, whilst Tajikistan, on the other hand, has had the same man in power since 1994. Now, obviously we have entire episodes going into this in more detail elsewhere, so today we're going to keep our focus pretty squarely on the militaries of Central Asia. But as a bit of a starting point, I think it's probably a good idea for everyone to understand the dynamics between these 5 militaries, because there are some pretty big gaps between them. Now, obviously I'm wildly oversimplifying here. If we were to measure and compare the capabilities of the 5 Central Asian republics, and place the 5 republics on a bit of a scale, with the weakest of the militaries, Tajikistan, being placed at a 1, and Kazakhstan, the strongest of the 5 Central Asian militaries, being placed at a 10, when looking to place the other 3 republics, you'd probably find that Uzbekistan would be placed onto that scale somewhere between a 9 and a 9.5, and in fact only recently giving up that top spot to Kazakhstan. Either way though, imagine them somewhere around the 9 and the 10 on the scale. If we go from there down the scale a bit, looking somewhere around the 5 or 6 out of 10, that's where you probably place Turkmenistan's military, as whilst it's very capable in some areas, it's also pretty poor in others. And if we go from there right down to the bottom of the scale, we'd probably only find Kyrgyzstan at a 1.5 or maybe even a 2. The fact being that even when you combine the military budgets of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan together, they would still only make up around a quarter of what Kazakhstan has in their military budget, and only about 0.5% of what Russia spent on the military last year. So needless to say, these are fairly small militaries with fairly small budgets. And whilst on paper these militaries do seem very small compared to Uzbekistan, Russia or China, until recently these guys have been pretty evenly matched. Where that would all change is actually back in 2022, where the two sides were now in a bit of conflict with one another, as after nearly a year of small border skirmishes between the two, eventually the two sides would go to head, with the conflict leaving about 200 dead and about 150 more wounded. But what was also wounded in that conflict was both sides' pride and ego, as both militaries ended up taking on significant damage, but in the end there was a white peace, so no territory changed hands, and the conflict really only ended because Russia put significant pressure on both sides to find an end to it. Now, despite this being arguably the most serious battle in Central Asia in recent years, the conflict between these two nations didn't actually involve a large amount of personnel. In fact, it mostly revolved around not even the ground forces, but actually instead mostly the border forces of each country, at least initially until other branches began to show up. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the difference between ground forces, mobile forces, and border forces, well, you might want to check out part 1 of this mini-series, where we break that down in a lot more detail. But in short, the ground forces of both Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are more akin to what we'd consider something like the US Army, possessing most of the nation's tanks, armored vehicles, and what we typically associate with an armed forces. Whereas in comparison, the border forces, which in Tajikistan is known as the Tajik Border Service, and in Kyrgyzstan known as the State Border Guard Service, well, these operate outside of the conventional militaries, and instead fall under the direction of the intelligence services. So to put it in US terms, the army has its own army, and it would be like the CIA having its own border patrol forces that kind of acts like an army, but also only answers to the CIA. Now, when the conflict began, it was these two lighter border forces that actually ended up engaging each other. And because neither side had the heavy weaponry, the concentration of armor, or the necessary logistical backup, it meant that last time there were no real significant territorial gains, with both sides only ever advancing a few kilometers into the other's territory. So with that in mind, we decided to take a closer look at not only what both nations have done since 2022, and what all of that increased spending has actually bought them, but also specifically what might happen if, instead of relying on their border forces stationed in the area to carry out this assault, and it being almost an accidental thing that spirals out of control, what if Tajikistan were to launch a premeditated, concentrated and coordinated effort to try and seize the Kyrgyz city of Batken? If they actually made a full effort to do so, what would be the actual result? And here's when I want to introduce this week's guest. Derek Bisaccio is the lead analyst specializing in Russia and Central Asia for the defense analysis firm Forecast International, and is an expert on the Russian and Eurasian defense markets, as well as Russian and Central Asian defense and strategy. He's also a very good friend of the project, and we're thrilled to have him back on the show today. So Derek, I guess to begin this, what sort of purchases have these two sides been making since 2022, and how do you think they'll affect this operation?
So in particular, drones. And this was something that we saw just in the lead up to those clashes. Kyrgyzstan in particular has gone to Turkey, and they've started shopping for almost everything that Turkey is offering. They've purchased TB2s, Akincis, both of which are produced by Baykar Makina. And then they've also gone to Turkish Aerospace Industries. They've purchased the Aksungur. Those first 3 drones I've mentioned have all been seen in service. They've also stated that they purchased the Anka drone. I haven't seen that yet, but supposedly that's going to be delivered this year. On Tajikistan's side, they had already been working with Iran to set up a drone plant of their own side, which is producing the Babel 2. They've worked to build that one up, and then just 2 months ago, Tajikistan actually rolled out some of its own local creations and said, hey, this is now something that we're going to be doing ourselves. So as I said, drones have been the major focus. They've also purchased or started setting up some shops to produce armored vehicles. But what's noteworthy is these countries don't have major budgets. A lot of their spending is going towards personnel upkeep, maintenance of equipment that they have. And so where they're purchasing things is very sporadic, but very targeted. So as far as at least officially a Babel 2, which is the primary version of it is a reconnaissance drone. As far as what public statements have been out there, there hasn't been evidence that they are producing the loitering munition version of it, but I certainly think Tajikistan would be very interested in doing so, just given the trend in the militaries around the world, which is introducing a lot more of those systems into service.
Now, since that conflict, we have seen both sides arming and preparing for another conflict in the future between the two. But whilst Tajikistan hasn't acquired too many new systems or platforms, they have purchased a few new drones, added some modernization kits to some of their vehicles, and increased the number of MLRS systems or multiple launch rocket systems available to the forces. Meanwhile, Kyrgyzstan has made significant strides in upgrading its military capabilities here in the south, often to the detriment of other areas of the country. They've increased the number of personnel down here, purchased more drones for their nearby drone base in Jalalabad, and even acquired a new S-125 air defense battery from Belarus, all of which is now being positioned just to the south of the battlefield here. Now obviously in the full report, we've included all the maps, documents, diagrams, photos, everything else you might need. But since this is an audio format, we'll try and do our best to describe the area we're talking about here. And for a lack of better exploration, since we're talking about near the very north of Tajikistan and near the very south of Kyrgyzstan, the Tajiks' territory here will look a little bit like a lowercase r, whilst Kyrgyzstan's territory will look a little bit like an uppercase J, positioned just underneath the arm of the R, meaning that whilst the majority of Kyrgyzstan is to the north of Tajikistan, in this case it'd actually be Tajikistan invading Kyrgyzstan from the north. It's a bit confusing, but hopefully that explains some of the terminology later. So lowercase r with an uppercase J jammed underneath the arm of the R. Now the battlefield we're talking about here primarily evolves around the Kyrgyz town of Batken, a fairly small Kyrgyz city located about 10 kilometers from the Tajik border, with both the major Kyrgyz city in this scenario, Batken, and the major Tajik city in this scenario, Isfara, both being very far away from their capital cities, with Batken being about a 300 kilometer drive from its nearest major city, Osh, and over 1,000 kilometers of mountain driving away from its capital, Bishkek. Whilst for Tajikistan, they're only 100 kilometers away from the nearest large city, being Khojand, but nearly 500 kilometers away from the capital city, Dushanbe. And if you remember from our first piece, all the driving here is incredibly slow, often subject to landslides, and a bit of a logistical nightmare for anyone trying to move lots of equipment from point A to point B. So to provide logistical support to either of these fronts is a real pain in the ass for either side. Now, under normal circumstances, a large-scale conflict like the one we're talking about here is pretty unlikely to happen. One, for a whole bunch of reasons we'll talk about afterwards, also because of the fact that Tajikistan's military is probably pretty acutely aware of the increased military funding and partnerships currently in place with both Russia and China, both of which could exert significant pressure on the Tajik government if they chose to intervene or attempt to prevent the conflict. So Derek, I'm going to throw to you for this one. What do you think would happen if Russia or China were to, let's say, discover the buildup of Tajik forces along the border here, or catch wind that they are about to invade Kyrgyzstan at such a large scale? What sort of pressure could they put on Tajikistan to try and pull back here?
Between the two of them, I would find it probably more likely that Russia would be the one that would discover this. Although if China did, I think China would be a little more on back channels to try to get both of these countries to knock it off effectively. But Russia has a lot more hard tools to work with if it wants to pull strings here. I guess, so to speak, the nuclear option would be Russia could remind Tajikistan how heavily dependent it is on remittances sent from Tajik workers back home to Tajikistan. Depending on the given year, it could be anywhere from 30 to 40 to 50% of Tajikistan's GDP is made up of those remittances. And the problem starts emerging very, very quickly if those are cut off. So if Russia gets wind of an offensive, of course, these are both CSTO countries. Both of them are allies of Russia. Russia isn't going to want a war between the two of them. Russia could go ahead and say, well, here's the thing. We're going to completely cut off your flow of remittances. And it's going to hurt Tajikistan's economy right away. A lot of households that depend on those remittances aren't going to be able to spend. So they're going to be cutting back their spending. And then it'll also be very destabilizing for the Tajik currency. Without as much hard currency coming in, that's going to be very inflationary. That'll put a ton of pressure on the Tajik government to, if they haven't already launched this operation, to not do it at all, or if they have started it, to basically cut, wherever it is and cut it off at that point.
And this is where we have to introduce the first caveats to our scenario. As frankly, if you actually play things out logically, because of the fact that Tajikistan doesn't actually keep a lot of troops here along this section of the border permanently, the moment they start moving that amount of men and material up toward the border, and they are discovered, very likely that Russia or China would put pressure on Tajikistan to try and dissuade them from going through with the invasion. And with their economy being so reliant on the Russians, there's not too much the Tajiks could do except for pull back and abandon the invasion. So our scenario here, we've had to add the caveat that no one discovers their build-up or knows this is coming. We're also adding that the Kyrgyz don't discover the invasion either, as if Bishkek was aware, they would likely alert the Russians or the Chinese, or simply shift more of their personnel out from cities like Osh and Jalalabad into the theatre ready for the Tajik invasion, making it much harder for the Tajik forces in the first few days. To try and give the Tajiks the best possible starting position for this, we're starting on the assumption that the Kyrgyz are caught completely off guard by this, which again is a pretty big caveat, but will make sense when we added it later on. The other big caveat we added into this is that there is the political will to do so, as whilst the two sides are going through this arms race, and both sides are very much preparing for a conflict with one another, to actually launch an invasion of this scale is probably going to go pretty badly for any administration who launches it. And whilst there are numerous strategic realities that will influence the decision-making on Tajik defense planners, there are two key factors that are likely to take precedence over anything else. The first, and something you'll probably see across all of the republics, is that leadership in Dushanbe will prioritize domestic stability over any offensive military capabilities, particularly in scenarios like this, where significant domestic opposition would be expected if the financial and economic sanctions begin to impact the wider Tajik population. In other words, in the odd case they would be willing to carry out the offensive, they still want to prioritize making sure their government is safe at home. And as a result, military commanders are likely to only be granted access to a very limited number of personnel and equipment for the forthcoming expeditionary operations, as that way Dushanbe can assure that sufficient resources are not only retained within the major cities to be able to control the population. In other words, whilst the war is important, making sure they can protect themselves at home is far more important than the war. Now, the second critical factor will be the prioritization of speed. And this is where I want to bring in a concept called DCR and DSR, as understanding these is not only important to understanding this war, but also other wars in real life as well. So here we have two key concepts, the DCR, or daily consumption rate, and the DSR, or the daily sustainment rate. Now, obviously we're oversimplifying things here, but I also want to keep this under 3 hours for you. But the DSR is essentially how much material your force can supply to your military on a daily basis. Essentially, how much stuff can you get to the troops? And again, troops having materials is pretty important. As remember, a soldier without bullets is essentially just a poorly dressed tourist. Now, the DSR figure can change depending on a whole range of factors, like how many train lines lead toward the front, how hard it is to load and unload the materials you have. Is it on shipping containers, or is it just all thrown into the back of a truck? What are the qualities of the facilities for transferring these supplies like? This is particularly important if you're trying to get things, let's say, off of a train or off of a boat and toward the front, as well as how many of these specialized trucks and vehicles you have ready for these tasks, like how many forklifts you have, and particularly when it comes to things like Ukraine, how many fuel trucks you have available. As all of these, if you get it wrong, can either slow down or reduce your DSR. Now, there are other factors in this as well, like how difficult it is to get critical parts, say things like replacement gearboxes for your tanks, as whilst it might just be one small part for your vehicle, it can make the whole vehicle unusable. But for this exercise, we're going to keep it quite simple. In short though, the DSR is effectively how much stuff you can bring to the troops each day. And for all 5 of these Central Asian republics, their DSR capabilities are actually quite limited. They simply just don't have the capacity to move massive amounts of material around each day, for a whole range of factors we'll go into as we go on. And where the Central Asian republics tend to suffer is actually a lot of the time where the Soviets used to suffer as well. That being the last mile problem, getting supplies along that final stretch to the front line. And as a real world example, let's look at Ukraine for a second. Now, both the Ukrainians and the Russians are actually pretty good at getting material generally to the area of the front, whether it be by train or by truck convoy. Getting stuff toward the front is pretty easy. The hard part for both sides at the moment seems to be getting those supplies off of trains that can carry thousands and thousands of kilos of cargo and onto individual trucks that need to drive out to the front line, wasting time packing each individual truck or losing these trucks to enemy action, which is something that's quite prevalent when it comes to fuel trucks, which is usually where the last mile of logistics is probably the hardest part. Now, as an army, you can try and get around this problem before you launch the war by stockpiling a whole bunch of materials closer to the front. And it does work around some of these issues temporarily, but stockpiling large amounts so close to the front also comes with significant risks. As if you put months of supplies right behind the border, not only are you more likely to be discovered and therefore blow the whole operation, but even once the war kicks off, and if you placed your entire month's supply of ammunition within drone range, well, congrats, you've probably just created the world's most expensive fireworks display. For the sake of simplicity to understand the concept, we'll just imagine all of our supplies are just a generic unit of supply. And imagine our Tajik force has a daily sustainment rate of around +5, which means the Tajiks are capable of bringing up +5 units of supply each day. So we understand DSR. Now let's take a look at DCR, the daily consumption rate. This is essentially the reverse of DSR, how much material our forces are using up each day. And your DCR can also vary wildly depending on the size and activity of your force. So let's say a smaller force, like a single battalion, well, they actually might have a very low DCR. After all, there's only a few men, so you have to bring in less food, less bullets, and less beds. But that might not be a big enough force to achieve what you're hoping to do. So you want to bring in more men so you can actually win the war. But when you do, larger forces also come with their own challenges. And what you find quite often is whilst your DSR is capped by the amount of rail and logistical network you have, your DCR can grow almost exponentially, as more men means more fuel, more tents, more facilities, and more cartons of the white-flavored monster being consumed. Essentially, the more men, the higher the DCR. But how you use those men also affects your DCR. For example, let's get back to our arbitrary figures. Now, we know we can sustainably bring in +5 DSR, although admittedly that will lower over time as trucks break down, our facilities get bombed, or we begin to run low on supplies. But for now, let's just keep it at a solid +5 every day. Now, if the Tajik forces are to go on the offensive, they're likely going to be using lots of artillery shells, lots of bullets trying to dislodge the enemy, lots of vehicles and troops, and it's going to require a lot more supplies, which may burn through 10 units of supply a day. And if we actually want a force large enough to achieve our goal, we're probably actually going to burn through something closer to 20 units of supply a day, which is far larger than the 5 units we can actually sustain per day. Meaning that even if we were to stockpile 100 units of supply, our Tajik force at that tempo would run out of supplies by around day 7, which is not a great place to be. On the other hand, if we are neutral, we don't actually push, we just hold our positions, well, we might be able to reduce our DCR to 10 units a day, which means our supplies can effectively last until 20 days. Or if we were to, let's say, switch to a defensive position, digging along some riverbed or some terrain feature that's very easy to defend, well, we could potentially bring that DCR right down to 5 units a day, as you're not going to be wildly firing bullets at anything that moves at night if there's a river between you guys. And at 5 units a day, we could pretty much keep ourselves supplied indefinitely. So as you can see, there is always going to be a trade-off between supply burn rates and the operational tempo of the campaign. And if you need a real-world example to put your head around it, we actually saw this play out in real time during the war in Ukraine, as during the first few days of the February campaign, Russia was pushing really hard at Ukraine on a whole bunch of fronts, using lots and lots of men and material. Doing so, hoping to force Ukraine into capitulation as quickly as possible and have the war over in a couple of days. Now, when you go this aggressive with this many men, you end up having a phenomenally high DCR rate, way above what Russia could ever hope to sustain. But if the calculation was speed over sustainability, assuming that by overwhelming the Ukrainians the war would be over in a few days, and that the Russians would be in Kiev long before the stockpiles run out, well, it doesn't really matter how high the DCR rate is. However, if the war, let's say, didn't go as you planned, and instead ended up being a prolonged, sustained conflict, well, that's the point where you need to rethink your DCR, which is why Russia, in April, now realizing this is not going to be a quick war and instead a very long drawn-out affair, strategically repositions themselves to bring down their DCR by doing things like giving up all of their ground north of Kiev and pulling back into Belarus, so those troops can be put back in a base rather than trying to sustain them in the field, or in some place retreating to more defensible lines, as well as doing things like focusing their offensives usually to just 1 or 2 sections of the front at a time rather than the whole front at once, dramatically reducing their DCR so they can maintain their forces over a longer period and ensure that number never hits 0. Okay, so that's the basics of DSR and DCR. And now we might have a better understanding of why the consensus between all the academics and military personnel we asked seemed to be that Tajikistan, if they were going to do this, would try to launch a very short, sharp campaign against Batken, and that the second critical factor for defense planners in Tajikistan will be the prioritization of speed, with Dushanbe aiming to capture the targeted cities as swiftly as possible and establish defensible positions before the Kyrgyz or any other external forces can mount a cohesive response to the offensive. And even though this approach would consume significantly more supplies on a daily basis, by the Tajiks being willing to probably commit a full brigade and maybe an additional battalion to this, capture as much ground as possible, and give them a better negotiating position when Russia or China inevitably forces the two to the negotiating table. Now, during peacetime, Tajikistan's standard military presence along this section of the border is actually fairly minimal, only really containing police units, small SOBR platoons, and some lightly armed border service units. There's no real massive amount of tanks or armoured vehicles already sitting here. So any significant redeployment of ground or mobile forces by Tajikistan into the area, in reality, would probably give them away on what they're about to do. But again, as we said earlier, we are running under the assumption that Kyrgyzstan is unaware of the preparations going on here. Okay, so from here, let's actually get into the fighting. And again, we're starting this conflict suggesting that the Tajiks got all their troops to the front, that they got all their supplies there intact. They have a fairly reasonable stockpile of fuel and ammunition sitting in Isfara, and for this exercise we even gave them the added benefit, suggesting the Tajiks are willing to commit an entire brigade to this, most likely the separate air assault brigade positioned in Khujand, as well as an additional battalion, most likely the 17th Rapid Response Battalion. The first being a pretty good fighting force, and the second being a not particularly heavily armed unit, but one that fights well and can move pretty quickly. And we're going to suggest that all of these are now positioned along the border with Kyrgyzstan, ready to go. Again, something our experts tended to think was not possible, but something that when we didn't include it, we found that Russia and China shut the conflict down too quickly. Now, the incident that actually kicks off the war doesn't really matter for us. It's not what we're looking at here. What we instead focused on are the kind of exercises and drills that the Tajik military's done, preparing for a scenario like this, as well as looking at some of their Tajik training manuals to understand what sort of order and tactics they'd likely launch an invasion like this with. And once we understood that and gave that to the Tajik team, we then started looking through Kyrgyz military materials to understand roughly the same thing, effectively now looking at how both sides would respond to such an event. Now, under textbook Soviet offensive doctrine, an operation of this nature would usually involve the utilization of overwhelming initial air power and precision airstrikes by the attacker, with the Tajiks hoping to target as much of the enemy command and control centers, ammunition depots, and critical infrastructure as possible in those first strikes. The aim being to diminish the defender's capacity to respond effectively. However, this is Tajikistan, a nation with no jet air force and just a handful of very old helicopters, some of which have seen service during the Soviet-Afghan War. And this isn't even the only constraint, as Tajikistan's air capabilities, particularly in its limited access to longer-range offensive drones, and its very limited amount of Mi-24 attack helicopters, most of which would have to be moved up from the south of the country to the north of the country days before the offensive, begin to show us before we even start this offensive some of the problems that are going to be present in the Tajik military here. And as a result, for the scenario of this nature, it's probable that the Tajik Air Force will probably only be able to comfortably allocate a handful of maybe Ababil 2s and possibly 1 to 3 helicopters for this initial strike, all of which are now also going to have to operate out of Khujand Airport, 100 and something kilometers to the west. So from here, and following the standard Tajik doctrine, we would expect that the Tajik helicopters would take off from Khujand Airport sometime in the early morning, possibly followed in tow by a handful of converted Ababil 2 drones. These would take off in the darkness and begin heading eastward toward the Kyrgyz border before crossing into Kyrgyzstan sometime before dawn, hoping to catch as many Kyrgyz troops while they're sleeping in barracks. Now, the expected targets for these initial strikes would probably include the key targets such as military installations in Batken and probably the air defense batteries southeast of Bujam, with these batteries being about roughly another 10 kilometers further south of Batken. And if successful, there probably would be some secondary targets, including key sites like the Air Traffic Control Center at the Batken Airport and some of the key communications facilities. But again, there's only going to be a very limited amount of helicopters and a very limited amount of missiles they can carry. So there's only so much the Tajiks will probably be able to hit on this first run. But should the first run be successful, and again, we are putting our thumb on the scale to say it will be, we might see the Tajik helicopters successfully hit their targets and then head back into Tajikistan to refuel and resupply themselves for a secondary run. The secondary run probably occurring hours later once the rest of the Tajik forces have begun to cross the border. Now, the pilots would receive their orders, head back to Khujand, and begin redeploying back towards Batken, However, by the time the Tajik helicopter fleet would have arrived in Khujand, turned around and made it back into Batken for a second round of airstrikes, hours and hours would have passed. As Khujand's a fair while away, and Tajikistan's never been particularly fast at turnaround times for their helicopter fleet, with most of our experts in this exercise agreeing that by the time the Tajiks would arrive back into the theatre, the Kyrgyz would have likely been able to deploy their own drone assets from their drone bases in Jalalabad to the east, and would now have their personnel with shoulder-fired anti-aircraft weapons, with the Kyrgyz having access to things like Strela 2s, as well as the QW-2 and the QW-18, all of which Kyrgyzstan has been investing in heavily since the last tussle with Tajikistan in this region of the world. Now, Derek, we are giving these Tajik helicopters the benefit of surprise on the first run, but how well do you think they'll fare on the second one, now that it's hours later, and at least the local Kyrgyz here in the city are well aware that they're under attack by the Tajiks? Would this be a far higher risk of being shot down by going for this second run?
My expectation would be that it would be. I know the Russians have tried to put a lot of different countermeasures on their helicopters. Maybe some of that has filtered out to their allies. The main question here, and this is actually a big question for the whole operation entirely, is what shape is all this equipment in? A lot of this stuff it was acquired, decades ago. That goes for the helicopters, and something that can go for the missiles as well. And if they haven't been able to either adequately maintain the helicopters, and then on the missile side, if those missiles are very, very old, it's almost anybody, anything could go with it, in this sense that some of these missiles may just not be in proper shape, or some of the launcher platforms for them might not be. I certainly think if they are in good working condition, I think those helicopters are going to be in for a very bad time. And Tajikistan does not have a whole lot of them to lose. So if things start going south with that, if they start losing a couple helicopters, they might have to pull, the helicopters out of the game entirely.
And these are the sorts of insights we're looking for with this kind of wargaming. As while it's much harder to predict factors like a pilot's skill or performance, looking at some of the harder details like the fact that only 1 to 3 helicopters would actually be available for this early strike, and that attempting a second sortie would likely result in the loss of 1 or 2 of them, well, that actually does tell us a great deal about the position the attacking side is starting from. However, now that we've got these first strikes out the way, we would then expect to see the Tajiks begin to cross the border, with the Kyrgyz border mostly just manned by members of the border service, so fairly lightly armed and equipped with very little in the way of countermeasures against any sort of armoured thrust. Again, we're envisioning they are caught by surprise. Now from here, we'd likely see 2 axes of advance from the Tajiks into Kyrgyzstan. The one heading east is most likely going to be taken by the 17th Rapid Response Battalion, as these guys have the furthest to cover on day 1. Now, as I said, these guys will be fairly lightly armed and not carrying a huge logistics train with them, but are still very likely to breeze past the Kyrgyz border outpost toward the Kyrgyz town of Zartash and the Aktepe bridge crossings, both located approximately 15 kilometers inside of Kyrgyzstan. As if we imagine our battlefield here, along the eastern edge of the battlefield is an Uzbek exclave and the 2 bridges across the river, meaning that if the 17th can hold these bridges, they might be able to prevent anything coming in from the east, because the east is where the rest of the Kyrgyz army is going to be coming from. Now, while these lighter Tajik units will be capable of advancing quickly, they're only going to be equipped with a very limited arsenal of portable light machine guns, assault rifles, a pretty small allotment of anti-armor weaponry, including maybe some RPG-7s, some SPG-9s, and a few old 9K38s for some portable anti-air weapons. But they're also likely to be pretty vulnerable to attacks from tanks or larger caliber artillery. Now, there are 2 bridges across this river, and that small battalion will have to probably hold both of them, stretching the battalion's resources even thinner. And with Batken being the primary focus of this assault, these lighter units are probably not going to get very much support either, and the commanders will know that. As looking at what the Tajiks have available when it comes to things like fuel trucks and logistics vehicles, they're likely only going to be able to supply either Batken or the bridges, not both. And Batken's obviously going to take priority here, as that's where the active fighting is going to be, being that the 17th is pretty likely to take these bridges with minimal resistance. So now that the Tajiks control the bridge crossings to the east, let's look back at our main thrust toward Batken. So on the front, we're assuming that the Kyrgyz are caught off guard and in a bit of disarray, having had their bases hit during the night. So now with the Tajiks just pushing through the lightly armed border outposts, it's only a 5-kilometer journey from the Tajik border to the northern end of Batken, and if moving fast enough, only a 20-minute drive before the Tajiks reach the city's main base. Now, whilst what's in the city at the moment could easily repel any sort of small border incursion, and in all honesty would probably give the Tajiks a good run for their money, it was assumed and evaluated across the exercise that the Kyrgyz's comparative deficiency in armoured vehicles and a lack of stockpiled anti-armour weaponry being kept in Batken in most cases would see them only putting up a token fight at the beginning here, and instead withdrawing most of their forces from both Batken and Bujum, as the two towns are essentially connected, out of these cities toward the southeast, probably hiding out in some of these mountain settlements like Karabulak, meaning the Taji forces will likely take up occupation of Batken and Bujum within the first day or two. But Derek, in such a situation where the Tajiks have been able to throw such a large force at Batken, how likely do you think it is that the Kyrgyz would opt to withdraw back out of the city and regroup somewhere in the south?
The problem, defensive Batkin, especially considering that they would be working against a full-blown brigade, and they're just defending it with a few battalions. I think they'd find it very, very difficult to defend that city. I think ultimately the Kyrgyz commander would want them to pull back. The problem, though, is reinforcing this, as has been shown in this scenario. Reinforcements it's very hard for them to get there. This is, of course, very mountainous terrain, and there's about 2 general routes that they can take to reinforce, one of which, as far as reinforcing Batken, one of which goes through Uzbekistan's territory, that exclave, and I don't think Uzbekistan would let them through. But if I were the commander in a situation that's that hopeless, I don't believe I would want them to fight to the last man in Batken, because that would just end up being too heavy of a loss without any real purpose. I don't believe Tajikistan, if they took Batken, I don't believe they would go chasing through the rest of those, the roads that run south and southeast of it. I don't think they'd chase the Kyrgyz military out that way. So I don't see there's a real reason to, throw good lives away just for the sake of, holding a city that can't be held in that short of time frame. I think you wait till the cavalry arrives, or you wait till external pressure puts the conflict to an end.
But before we get too attached to the victory here, this is actually where things start to become really difficult for the Tajiks, as based on the state of their armor and the distance they've been forced to cover already, the Tajik military units will need to commence pretty essential maintenance, refueling, and retrofitting activities for all of their vehicles and equipment that have just fought in the battle. Additionally, they'll also need to evacuate all of their casualties to field hospitals in Isfara or further out, depending on how bad the injuries are, as well as replenish their soldiers' ammunition, food, and stockpiles, either from what they could bring forward in Isfara or from other stockpiles all the way back in Khujand. And all of these tasks are pretty likely to prevent any further advances beyond Batken or Bujum until offensive readiness and logistical support systems can be restored to the force and they can be brought back up to advanced condition. And one of the problems here is, you see, unlike Russian or American field repair stations and depots, which can be set up and established pretty quickly, with the Americans having some of the best technology for mobile refueling stations, the Tajiks, well, they're going to have to rely on makeshift field repair stations, as well as unarmored motorized convoys stretching all the way back into Tajik territory. They're going to have to rely on these things for every nut, every bolt, every wrench, and every gallon of fuel, assuming the Kyrgyz were smart enough to either blow up or taint the fuel supplies remaining in town. With all of these Tajik unarmored convoys heading south, likely to come under significant aerial threat from Kyrgyz drones as the campaign continues on. So Derek, the Tajiks have advanced about 4 kilometers on the eastern front and arrived at the edge of the river, and about 17 kilometers on the main front, having taken the main city and main objective. But why do you think they'd stop here? Why not attempt to chase the retreating Kyrgyz back into the hills?
Right. So there's only so far that they can punch, in a given time frame, from the sense that you're moving a ton of armored vehicles, you're moving a ton of tanks. These are going to need fuel. You, of course, are moving personnel as well. They need food, they need water. And to bring this up, to get that to Batken, for example, you're either going to need those helicopters, which hopefully did not suffer too heavily, or you're going to have to drive it there because, as we said, there is no rail that'll connect you all the way to Batken. So that is going to limit the extent that they can plausibly go without overstretching their supply lines. Now, the X factor sort of with this is, what have the Kyrgyz drones been doing while Tajikistan is trying to bring logistic support to its troops? Presumably, some of those roads are going to be targets. They're going to be hitting, anything that's moving, any big trucks, certainly an armored vehicle, but, any of the logistics is going to fall prey to that. I don't believe Tajikistan has the sort of air defense capability to defend its logistics routes that effectively if they were launching an offensive like this. Again, knowing that you can't support all these guys going that far. It seems that Batken sort of the furthest they can push, at least in like the span of a few days, without getting too overstretched.
Now, once the Kyrgyz are aware of what's going on, not only are they going to start rallying and preparing their forces stationed to the east in places like Osh and Kokjangak, they're also likely to begin deploying a varied array of UAV platforms, including the Bayraktar TV-2, Sara-2s, Aksungas, and Akinsis, with each of these platforms pretty likely to inflict considerable additional damage on the Tajik forces as they enter the theatre. In such a circumstance, it would be pretty reasonable that Kyrgyz UAV operators would be expected to carry out targeted strikes against Tajik forward command posts, communication hubs, tanks, fuel trucks, field repair stations, tracked vehicles, and resupply convoys travelling from Isfarar toward Batken, as we've talked about on the program a few times, and as we've observed during combat in places like Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh and Ukraine. These drones are capable of inflicting some pretty substantial damage. However, while this initial wave of drone strikes will be pretty problematic for the Tajik forces, the scope and intensity of UAV operations are expected to increase significantly over the following days, as additional resources, ammunition and systems are being reallocated from the northern sectors of Kyrgyzstan toward the southern airstrips in Osh and Jalalabad. That being said though, while the tempo of airstrikes will take some time to reach its peak rate, it is expected to slow down after about 1 to 2 weeks of high-tempo strikes, due to Kyrgyzstan's limited stockpiles of ground attack missiles, placement drone parts, and repair facilities, often actually relying on the Turkish to do part of their repair jobs. So given the aerial threats the Tajiks will be facing at this point, they'll begin to follow the same sort of playbooks that the Russians have in Ukraine, seeking refuge for their vehicles within civilian structures. Now, for the Tajiks, this does serve a dual purpose, as it temporarily shelters the vehicles, and also conceals their assets from identification by drones. However, there's not going to be a big enough building to hide all the Tajik vehicles, so it means they'll have to start dispersing their vehicles throughout the rest of the city, which, while keeping them safe, also wildly complicates logistical efforts, and also introduces an added risk from sabotage by local paramilitary actors, or exposure of military asset locations via civilians posting about it on social media. But with the Kyrgyz drones hovering overhead and no easy way to counter them, there isn't much the Tajiks can do but this. This stage here, when the armor has made it into Batken, but they are unable to push off and move to another place, how dangerous is that for the Tajiks?
It's extremely dangerous, especially because a lot of the positions that they might take for granted that, okay, we can set up shop over here, might not be available to them. A lot of when we going back to how we were thinking about the planning stage for this, okay, if everything goes right, you don't get detected. So if you're expecting that you're going to have, say, around 80 or 90 armored personnel carriers that actually made it into Batken, well, what happens if you've lost, say, a third of them to drones? Another third of them don't work because of either poor maintenance in general, or you just couldn't find the equipment to maintain them out there, or you can't get equipment out there to maintain them. Now your force is looking a lot different. So what you were expecting to be able to defend this city with, once you've taken it, your tools are not there.
Now, I think we should probably take a moment and talk about the biggest impact there will be on this conflict, and that's the international factor. As in recent years, the geopolitical landscape of Central Asia has been increasingly shaped by a growing trend of deeper interregional trade and cooperative cross-border endeavors. So with this in mind, the onset of large-scale hostilities between two regional states is likely to provoke some pretty substantial pushback and concerns from some of the region's key stakeholders, the most notable of which is probably going to be Russia, China, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, as all of these countries are aiming to minimize the reputational damage to the region and avoid scaring away any external inbound FDI, and in such would probably expect it to promptly engage in concerted diplomatic efforts to try and persuade Dushanbe to cease its military actions and withdraw its force back into Tajikistan. Now, if these suggestions were all ignored and Rahmon refused to pick up Putin's phone call, these states have a series of financial levers and, if not outright threats, that they can use against Tajikistan. The larger actors in particular have the capacity to do things like inflict significant financial and social damage to the Tajik economy, either through the deportation of groups of Tajik workers back to Tajikistan in efforts to catalyze domestic unrest, and in the case of Russia, Moscow has even harder methods it could use, such as the fact it has a very large military garrison sitting right there in Dushanbe, only a few minutes' drive from the president's palace. At a minimum, it would probably be expected that Russian leadership would start initiating a series of diplomatic engagements, and with the governments of Dushanbe and Bishkek, and avoid further fracturing this region of the world. Additionally, from speaking with other experts, it is fairly likely that Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan would implement security measures and seal their respective borders with Tajikistan, which, while minimally burdensome for those countries, it would inflict substantial economic hardship upon the Tajik citizenry, particularly on the consumer markets, which consequently kicks off increasing social animosity and rapid pressure on the administration from the people and the elites of the country, as Tajikistan relies on all of its consumer goods coming in through either Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, or China, and most of its money coming in through Russia. And if the elites can't get access to their money and start getting a bit uppity in the capital, well, the leadership of Dushanbe might start looking around and considering how worth it this war is. Again, if your country has, in some years, 51% of its economy funded by remittances, you don't really have much of a negotiating position with a man who can snap half your economy out of existence with a change of a visa law. But let's say for the sake of the argument that Tajikistan is not willing to take the hint and wants to keep going with this conflict. What now? Well, unfortunately, the cavalry is about to arrive. As domestic tensions grow within Tajikistan and Bishkek's air campaign of the region steadily intensifies, additional Kyrgyz forces are expected to begin arriving into the theatre towards the end of the first week. As in such a scenario, including the 1st Mountain Boater Rifle Brigade, the 24th Independent Special Purpose Brigade, along with some set units of the National Guard, most likely elements of the Airborne Panther Battalion, with these units leaving Osh and travelling westward along the highway toward the bridge crossing at Chongara. Now, Derek, if I put that journey into Google Maps, it tells me that it's actually around just a 4.5-hour drive. So why is it then that the first troops and the garrisons from Osh, particularly if they know it's this larger force sitting in Batken, don't arrive into the theatre until really the end of the week?
So there's a few different steps. First off, they need to get the warning, right? They need to know that not only is there something that's going on, but this is a major operation. And that you're not going to know that right away. So the first hour that there's fighting, it might look like a lot of the previous rounds of fighting. Even 2022 started off with just some skirmishes by border guards. And if you're information space, if you're not really aware of what the situation is, you might think that that's what's going on, and you haven't realized that, oh, wait, actually, there are armored vehicles rolling across the border, and they're heading right in. So the first step for them to be able to respond from Osh, to be able to move a lot of those units over, is to even know that the threat's happening, what it is, how significant it is, and then get the decision that they need to start moving the military. Then it's, okay, how prepared were you for a scenario like this? So even if you didn't know this specific operation was coming, what is your base level of readiness for your units? How well have you kept your armored vehicles? Are any of them in rough shape? Are they all fueled up? Are you going to need to be able to do that right from your base? And then as you're starting to move westwards to get to the actual area of operations, that's a massive train of things that you're bringing with you. You're bringing tanks, you're bringing armored vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, you're bringing, their artillery, you're bringing any air defense systems with them, and then you're bringing a legion of trucks that are bringing all the supplies that go along with this. That's a massive undertaking to move something that quickly. And I think one instructive example for this would be that in 2022, when there were clashes between the border guards that started off, it was about 2 or 3 days of that going before all of a sudden some of the heavier weapons started getting involved. And that, I think, is very illustrative of the time it takes for equipment to start showing up in this type of theater.
Now from here, things begin to turn south quickly, as the pretty lightly armed 17th sitting at the bridge, now stretched between both the north and south bridge, are likely to come under either pretty heavy drone or heavy artillery strikes, leaving them not much choice but to either pull back out of their positions and leave the bridge free to cross, or continue to be pinned down whilst one of these smaller units either crosses the bridge themselves or lays a pontoon down. And with a lot of these forces having not gone through heavy combat before and unlikely to be supplied anytime soon, the moment one of those bridges gets crossed, it'd be pretty reasonable for the commanders of the 17th to want to pull back towards a position where they can't be cut off or surrounded, and thereby abandoning the bridges and the village overlooking the river, leaving their positions here and retreating west. For the 17th, who's dug in around the bridge and can be directly sighted and seen from the other side of the river, how dangerous is the position they're in?
Quite dangerous. So the scenario and the units on both sides that are quickest to be involved with this, most of Tajikistan's heavy armor and heavy artillery and all that is going to be tied up in Batken. That's the main thrust of the operation. So the units they'll be able to get out towards the bridges here with Zartash. They'll be able to get out this way relatively quickly, but they're lightly armed. Now, what they're going to be encountering, they'll encounter a full-blown motor rifle brigade. They'll be encountering their special forces brigade. They're the 24th. Those guys have tanks. They've got infantry fighting vehicles. They've got the whole 9 yards. So you're going to be dealing with them. You've got probably dismounted personnel that are attempting to deal with that with just anti-tank weapons. They can cause issues with that. They can ensnare them a little bit with that. But if you don't have artillery backing you, that's a very dicey prospect, especially if you're being hit by Kyrgyz artillery. The areas around those bridges are, to my understanding of the layout of the land, are lowlands. So there's not a whole lot of, at least directly around the bridges are lowlands. So on the western side of the river, there's not a whole lot of defensive fighting positions that you can take directly around the bridges. You can back a little bit up and then you're in high ground, but then you're having to defend Chongara and you're accepting that, okay, they're going to actually be able to get a foothold back across this bridge. I think if you look at sort of the initial offensive, I don't think Tajikistan would even want to go across this bridge for the same reason that they wouldn't be able to support it. If it were to come, this war wouldn't be something that would last for aeons and aeons. It's something that would be rather quick. Probably external pressure would be brought to bear. So both sides need to accomplish, in Tajikistan's case, it's offensive objectives, and in Kyrgyzstan's case, it's reactive defensive objectives. Both sides need to accomplish that very, very quickly before all of a sudden the guns are silenced because somebody from abroad has put a little bit too much pressure on them.
At this critical juncture in the war, Tajik commanders face a pretty difficult set of strategic decisions. As following the abandonment of the 18th position along the river and the overwhelming advantage of heavy vehicles and air power that the advancing Kyrgyz columns are likely to enjoy, the Tajiks must now decide between one of three strategic options. Now, so we have an idea in our head, I want you to imagine 9 boxes, with the first row being 1, 2, 3, second row being 4, 5, 6, and third row being 7, 8, 9, from left to right. So right now at this point in time, the Tajiks probably own squares 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7. 3 at the top, 2 in the middle, 1 at the bottom. Whilst the Kyrgyz own 6, 8, and 9. And from here, here's where the difficult decision needs to be made. As yes, the 17th would have pulled back into square 3, but square 3 is about to have 2 armoured forces barrel into it, and there's effectively no way that the 17th can probably hold that off. Now, if the 17th were compelled and told that Batken was the top priority, and that they should pull back from where they are and relink up with the rest of the Tajik forces in square 5 in the middle, well, in reality, all that really does is open up the highway from 3 to 2 to 1, allowing the Kyrgyz motorized forces to effectively advance straight into the Tajik rear and occupy Isfarar, the town that currently possesses all their supply lines, stockpiles, command centers, and the only train line leading back to Tajikistan. Meaning that yes, whilst they hold on to Batken, and that is politically advantageous, they've also just lost a major city and are now surrounded and cut off. Option 2 would be to launch a counter-offensive against the Kyrgyz as they advance up the highway, 17 attempting to hold square 3, whilst the forces in Batken leave Batken and make a hasty dash to counter them in 3. Now, this would be a purely tactical maneuver, because executing this option would not only require the 17th to hold its ground along the highway, utilizing only the armaments and supplies it could bring with it from Chongara, which, having been under artillery and drone attack, is probably not that much, but it would also require the separate air assault brigade that was currently sitting in Batken to gather up its entire logistical support system and advance 20-kilometer distance across the desert away from their more defensible positions in Batken and try and launch an offensive off of the march against an enemy who not only has air support, not only will continue to strike them as they come down that highway, but probably also outnumbers them in armoured capabilities when they get there. So should the commander opt for this action, the 17th limited armaments and the airborne brigade's exposure during their redeployment would probably constitute pretty critical points of failure. And all of that doesn't even defend Batken, as the Kyrgyz forces from earlier on that pulled out of the city into the mountains can now simply just move back into the city and reoccupy the positions. So option B isn't really a great option either. The only remaining option, option C, and the only other one left, is for Tajikistan to take its forces and simply retreat back into Tajikistan. Now, in this scenario, it would probably be the most prudent form of action, as the Tajik forces are always going to lose far less men, carrying out an orderly withdrawal back into Tajik territory. And while this maneuver would undoubtedly be politically damaging for Dushanbe, it does offer a significant strategic advantage to the commanders on the ground, as by repositioning their forces closer to the railheads and supply hubs in Isfarar, the Tajik units would be better situated to try and refit and replenish themselves and get back to some sort of fighting conditions in case the Kyrgyz were interested in travelling across the border to come get them. Particularly for the Air Assault Brigade, an early withdrawal back into Isfarar would also allow them to establish more defensible positions along the city's entry points. Even though that most of the experts we spoke with assumed that yes, while the Kyrgyz would be willing to put significant efforts down to push the Tajiks off of their territory, Moscow would likely be putting significant pressure on them to make sure they go no further. That as soon as the Tajiks leave the country, the war effectively comes to an end. And if there's pretty much no chance of victory on the table, well, this might be the best option they have left. The decision will need to be made, though, will be whether the leadership is willing to stomach that defeat, as Tajik forces pulling back over the border and abandoning their gains in Batken can be seen as little else. But then again, being defeated, surrounded, and ransomed back to the government is arguably worse. So Derek, where do the Tajiks go from here?
So I think part of the issue here is politically it's very toxic for them to attempt to hold Batken. There's no real claim that they can make for it. I think that's going to work against them. I mean, they could try to trot out a map from who knows when and say, look, we can control this. This was, once ours or something like that. But I don't think that's going to fly very well. And I don't think it's particularly defensible in the sense that once you lose control over the bridge area in the north, and once the Kyrgyz start advancing, there is this risk that the Kyrgyz could say, well, okay, if the gloves came off and you went into our territory and tried to take our, city from us, we're going to do the exact same thing right back to you. We are going to advance and we're going to completely surround your military. Now, all of a sudden, you have this situation where what was for 2 or 3 days, the glorious Tajik war, now all of a sudden your whole unit is surrounded and they don't have a whole lot of give with this. So if you lose this, one of these units, that severely cripples their ability to defend and provide security for northern Tajikistan in general. You've committed the primary motor rifle brigade that operates out of Khujand. What's defending Khujand, right? So even if nobody can get that far, they're going to have to worry about the fact that they can't suffer the loss of this unit. I think Batken in particular would be very hard for them to hold in that scenario, and there's not a whole lot of point to them doing so.
So how likely do you think it is that Tajikistan will be willing to launch a full-scale assault like this?
I think it's far too risky for far too little gain. I certainly would counsel the president. There's nothing that he's going to get out of this that's going to be significant enough value to Tajikistan. And nor is this a situation where they're seriously worried about, they're not worried about having to do a preemptive war. It's not a scenario where we're worried about, well, Kyrgyzstan, if they pull the trigger first, could go further along. They haven't really shown any appetite for that. So I don't think there's anything that presses Tajikistan to say, okay, this operation is going to have to come at some point, so we might as well go now. And this would be a very, very challenging operation. But I think particularly with drones, my belief would be that they don't have a very good mechanism of detecting and neutralizing these at scale in a war. And the amount of destruction that those can cause in a lot of different areas that they're not expecting. I mean, you expect to lose equipment right around the front line, but when you're dealing with Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan that don't really have strong air forces, you wouldn't expect to be hit in the rear as hard as those drones can. But the introduction of the drones really kind of shakes that up entirely.
In the end, given the high cost of prolonged conflict and the lack of any decisive strategic gain, Dushanbe's leadership will quickly face the reality that further continuation of hostilities would only lead to diminishing returns. And this mounting pressure on the government from both domestic and external sources is probably only going to intensify the government's desire to begin soliciting the opposing side for a negotiated end to hostilities. So regardless of the strategic option pursued here, it's anticipated that the hostilities would likely conclude within a window of 2 to 3 weeks anyway. And that pretty much brings us to our key findings. The first being around operational overreach and logistical challenges, as the Tajik military must be acutely aware of the significant operational risks associated with extending their forces beyond the logistical capabilities. That any attempt to conduct a substantial expeditionary campaign into the Balkan region, while potentially politically advantageous, poses substantial risks to Tajikistan. And as things stand, the Tajiks' current reliance on the theatre's inadequate road and rail networks, alongside its pretty deficient fleet of support and supply vehicles, and pretty limited rotary wing air support, there really isn't much operational flexibility or sustainability in what the Tajiks would be hoping to achieve here. Moreover, the limited reserve and logistical support would further hamper the Tajiks' ability to respond swiftly to any changes in the battlefield, or evacuate casualties, or resupply any of these isolated units. As we saw, the moment the Tajiks managed to take Batken, they were pretty much stuck there repairing and refitting, just waiting for the Kyrgyz to rock up. So in this context, Tajik commanders must recognize that the logistical challenges they face are not merely just operational inconvenience, but instead critical factors that could determine the success or failure of their entire campaigns. As without any secure or reliable logistical sustainment system, the Tajik forces are almost inevitably going to either be surrounded, cut off, or unable to maneuver around fast enough. Our second key finding was just how devastating the constraints posed by the Tajiks' limited air power were. As given the Tajik Air Force's limited air warfare capabilities, Dushanbe was unable to carry out any of the required early strikes that would be absolutely necessary to disrupt the Kyrgyz command and control facilities, or against any of the Kyrgyz assets beyond the immediate theatre of operations. And this limitation is pretty significantly constrains Tajikistan's ability to diminish any of Kyrgyzstan's operational effectiveness, particularly in the opening stage of the campaign, and allows Kyrgyzstan to respond with a much more robust second strike. Now, overcoming this deficit for Tajikistan would necessitate some pretty significant investment into things like long-range missile technology and systems capable of striking targets in Batken, Osh, and Jalalabad, where all these drones are coming from. Now, that sort of missile technology is pretty widely available on the current defense market, but it's a very high per unit cost, and the quantities required for a successful first strike, in other words, what you need to actually take out all the Kyrgyz drones while they're on the ground still, is likely way above what the Tajiks can afford at the moment, meaning this is pretty much all out of the question for the Tajiks. So until there's a big injection of cash, well, Kyrgyzstan's probably going to dominate the skies for a while. The third key finding was around the unpredictability of negotiated outcomes, that the scenario we outlined here could go a number of ways. Technically, it is theoretically possible that Tajikistan could take all that ground, occupy Batken, and then Russia or China demanded enter the war there, potentially actually giving Tajikistan a pretty solid negotiating position. However, this is almost entirely dependent on Kyrgyzstan's willingness to not only engage in negotiations post-invasion, but also that Russia, China, Uzbekistan, and other countries would go along with the annexation, something that is so far outside the normal. So even in the best case scenario where the stars all align, it still really doesn't set the Tajiks up very well here. And the fourth is that, frankly, Tajikistan won't be able to launch something like this until it can actually balance its economic, internal security, and military commitments. As the moment they launch this assault, well, Russia is the main military supplier for both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and there's absolutely no way in hell that Russia would ever supply Tajikistan with what it requires to fight. On top of that, in their current position, where Russia can snap its fingers and 51% of the economy disappears, well, that's not a great place to be in either. So Russia, even without moving a single tank, really can put some massive pressure on Tajikistan to bring the war to a close. And even if the government refused to capitulate, and the pressure went on, there's going to be a lot of riots across the country. And again, as we talked about right at the beginning, that's the thing they probably fear the most. Okay, so there's our first scenario, showing that even if Tajikistan had all of the stars align, that they got the best case scenario in every single category, and that they got so many caveats going into this that frankly it made it almost absurd, they still end up in a terrible position, they still take on a massive amount of risk for an incredibly slim chance of success, and the most likely outcome being a whole bunch of tanks being lost for absolutely no gain. So at this point, Tajik commanders are probably better not going down that road. However, before any Kyrgyz listeners get all high and mighty about this, in the Kyrgyz chapter of the report we also looked at the reverse, and I can tell you, the Kyrgyz don't get that much further into Tajikistan before things start falling apart on them as well. But for now, let's put aside this first exercise and now take a look at the second, as this time it's Tajikistan that's being invaded.
Part 2. Brawling with the Behemoth, an Uzbek invasion of Tajikistan.
Our next scenario takes a look at Uzbekistan, the country with the largest population in Central Asia, and depending on which branches you include under the bracket of military, the largest military force in the region as well. And what would happen if they carried out an invasion of Tajikistan, a country with the lowest GDP and smallest military in Central Asia? Now, on paper, you'd expect that it'd be almost a no contest. The Uzbeks have a much larger military, much more modern equipment, their own fairly capable air force, and spend over 10 times as much on their military budget. But here's the thing. This is where geography and logistics quickly reveal themselves to be the real determinant factors here. Now, again, we don't think this is an imminent situation. These guys aren't looking for war, and as much as they have had tensions between the two of them in the past, and there are some nationalists in both countries who do dispute where the border should sit, today both leaders have a very cordial relationship and continue to work together on projects that only further integrate the two together. For the scenario here, we went back to a historical precedence, effectively the last time that Uzbekistan had threatened to invade Tajikistan. It was many years ago under the previous leader, and most of it stemmed over the use of water, as most of Uzbekistan's major rivers actually originate from Tajikistan. So when Tajikistan was planning on building a bunch of dams on these rivers, Uzbekistan did exert some pressure on Tajikistan to try and slow down that progress. These days, the two just work together and make it work. But for our scenario here, we imagine these disputes get out of hand, and Uzbekistan feels that it can use its military to force Tajikistan to the negotiating table in a weaker position. Now, as you'd expect with all these war games, we have to add a few caveats that deviate from what the reality probably is, as frankly either the war doesn't kick off, or it ends too quickly and we really don't get the information we were looking for. Now, much like the last scenario, the first critical assumption in this one is that Uzbekistan achieves complete surprise in its initial strikes on Tajikistan, successfully repositioning soldiers and assets to the necessary staging areas without alerting Dushanbe, Moscow, or Beijing. Whereas in reality, such large-scale movements of Uzbek troops and material would be nearly impossible to conceal, and a significant build-up along the Tajik border would undoubtedly raise alarm across the region. And once Russia becomes aware of Uzbekistan's intentions to invade Tajikistan, Moscow has many of the same levers that we saw them use in the last scenario. And when you play it out like that, most times the Uzbek forces surrender before they even launch the invasion. Which brings us to our second key caveat, that Uzbekistan will do whatever they can to try and avoid going to war with Russia. And this is a very big caveat. Uzbekistan is very reliant on Russia for a whole bunch of materials, whether it be military equipment, remittances coming back, or just general trade between the two nations. So the Uzbek team wants to make sure that they are not the ones to open fire on the Russians first, which sounds like a reasonable caveat to include. The only complicating factor being that there are Russian bases here in Tajikistan. And as we'll see going forward, that's going to make things a bit more complicated for the Uzbeks when they invade. Now, we're also making the assumption that the Russians are also seeking to avoid conflict with Uzbekistan. As, frankly, based on how they acted in Nagorno-Karabakh, we don't see that Russia really has the appetite to open up another front somewhere else. And that flows really nicely into our last caveat, which is the fact we're also assuming that once the conflict begins, despite Tajikistan's membership in the CSTO and the invasion clearly meeting the threshold for a CSTO intervention, Moscow will pressure Dushanbe not to invoke Article 4, this being the article that effectively mandates the mutual defense among member states. As given the current state of regional politics, Moscow probably realizes that even if Dushanbe were to invoke the treaty, its enforcement would probably falter due to the reluctance of other CSTO members to intervene militarily against Uzbekistan. After all, Armenia has one foot out the door, the Uzbek Air Force is one of Belarus's largest clients, Kazakhstan relies on Uzbekistan for a whole bunch of materials, and Kyrgyzstan relies on Uzbekistan, A, for a consumer market, and B, for a lot of its rail and transit needs. So after speaking with a number of experts, we felt comfortable adding the caveat that no, the CSTO will not come to Dushanbe's rescue, and Moscow would only come to Dushanbe's rescue if they are fired upon first. But that other plans will exert financial and political pressure on Uzbekistan, and speaking with experts, that seems to be the logical response to this one. With those caveats in mind, and before we even get into the scenario, how do you think this plays out?
So I think that the geography is going to be the biggest challenge for them. So even though if you take just the on paper look at the Uzbek military versus the Tajik military, the Uzbeks certainly dwarf them in all aspects, either in personnel and number of units, armored vehicles, and aerial capabilities. Everything is lending in favor of the Uzbeks, and there's obviously they have multiple borders with Tajikistan, and they control most of the entrances into Tajikistan. So not only can they press from multiple sides with the military, they can also cut Tajikistan off from a lot of its access to the outside world just by nature of just closing the borders, right? And that's going to put a lot of pressure on Tajikistan to capitulate. And I think in part an operation like this might be the hope that you put enough pressure on, you start marching into one of the cities, and that the situation crumbles, snowballs from there, and you've won the war without having to fire too much. But the part of the problem is Tajikistan being split as it is between North and South. These are two completely different theaters. So neither your northern operation nor your southern operation are necessarily going to be supporting one another. And you have this challenge of even if you defeat the regular army, well, there's all sorts of areas that your logistics lines can be harassed. You're not going to chase any units out into those mountains. That would be very, very difficult to do, but they can retreat into the mountains, and then they can come out and harass your supply lines as you're trying to move, more equipment into Dushanbe. Of course, Tajikistan fought a civil war at one point in time, and that was a very, very challenging one for that reason, in the sense that the militants could just hide out in the mountains and then come down and clash when they needed to.
Now, once again, there will be a few factors that will impact the decision-making of the Uzbek team here. We are going into this again under the assumption that they will prioritize domestic stability over everything else, as that's a pretty core tenement for all 5 of these republics. But the next decision that the Uzbek team has to make is regarding how many troops they're willing to commit to this and what their desired outcome for war will be. And this brings us back to the exact same DSR and DCR problems that we talked about in the Tajik section, where Uzbekistan could commit a small amount of troops to this fight, but is unlikely to capitulate the country quick enough that international sanctions won't begin to really bite. But committing lots of troops to the attack, and the burn rate for supplies goes absolutely through the roof. For Uzbekistan, the geography here does play some sort of advantage. As if we remember from the Tajikistan episode, the shape of Tajikistan is kind of a little bit like a side profile of a rabbit looking leftwards, with 2 sets of feet, a bit thinner in the middle where the belly is, the head, and then the ears jutting out from the top. And for Uzbekistan, the 2 key main cities are Dushanbe, roughly where the rabbit's head would be, and Khojand in the north, roughly about 2/3 the way up the ears. And for the Tajiks, their border with Uzbekistan is very extensive, and going clockwise here, running all the way from the tip of the front feet, right up the left side of the ears, over the top of the ears, and most of the way back down the back side of the ears. And this would play into how Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan, will be conducting the war, as Tajikistan's 2 largest cities, Dushanbe and Khojand, are both situated only approximately 50 kilometers away from the Uzbek border, and this proximity grants Tashkent a pretty considerable tactical advantage, as particularly for Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan, they really do lack any sort of strategic depth, and there's pretty little distance between the Uzbek border and the western edge of Dushanbe. Now, given these circumstances and the proximity they have to the border, the most logical strategy for the Uzbek forces would be to cross the border in overwhelming force, aiming to capture Dushanbe and Khojand as swiftly as possible, hoping that a rapid advance might ideally compel either the flight or collapse of the Tajik government. The ultimate outcome here for Uzbekistan possibly resembling something similar to the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, where Russian forces quickly overwhelmed the Georgian defenses both in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, began advancing relatively quickly up the highways, before the capital Tbilisi would eventually back down and give concessions to the Russians. Now, the Uzbek government could just advance on one of those 2 fronts, or choose to attack both fronts at once. Now, as Derek pointed out a little bit earlier on, these 2 theatres need to be almost seen as completely separate theatres, as running effectively along where the spine of the rabbit is are some of the tallest mountains anywhere in the world, and it's actually really difficult to get from the south to the north of the country. So there's very little chance that troops from the north will be able to support any from the south. But it also means that to pull an Uzbek troop off of the northern front will likely mean putting it all the way back onto the Uzbek train networks, and then all the way around Uzbekistan back into the very south of the country, and then up again into the west of Tajikistan. Now, Tashkent could decide to just launch one front or the other, but if they only have one shot at the element of surprise and are hoping to capitulate the government as fast as possible, most of those we spoke with agree that it'd probably be more plausible that they'd launch a dual front strategy, attacking the capital Dushanbe from the west and attacking Khojand from the west, north, and east. As whilst Dushanbe will probably remain the primary objective, seizing Khojand alone might be sufficient enough to bring the conflict to some sort of conclusion at the negotiating table. Now, in preparation for such an offensive, the Uzbek forces would begin the standard stockpiling and pre-positioning of essential supplies, including the standard communications equipment, ammunition, fuel, medical support. All of the good stuff would be moved out from logistical hubs in cities like Termez, Jizak, and Fergana, and closer toward the front line. And following these logistical preparations, if we read Uzbek manuals, the next step would be probably to establish things like forward command posts and C2 hubs or communication hubs right near the border, as these will be the middle relay points once the operation kicks off. From there, Uzbekistan would probably exploit its advantage in drones and begin doing overflights of Tajik airspace, surveilling the defenses they have and creating a list of primary targets for the initial strikes. And once all of these preliminary measures are in place, more substantial force redeployments and assemblies can start to begin, with units being repositioned from across the country into forward theatres in preparation for the offensive. Now, in this case, it won't matter too much if you're just listening along, but for anyone who really knows the geography of the area, the likely strategic locations they would gather in are places like Sufyan, Bekabod, Chanak, Horvas, Pop, and Kokand, likely pulling together both airborne, artillery, engineering, armoured, mountain rifle, and motor rifle brigades, for Uzbekistan to effectively be able to launch 4 assaults all at once, one massive one towards Dushanbe, and 3 minor ones, so they can approach Khojand from 3 sides all at once. Well, that's going to have a massive DCR rate, which again is fine if Tashkent is expecting or hoping that Dushanbe will surrender in day 1 or 2, an assumption that has proved nothing but successful when tried out in places like Ukraine. Now, whilst this model does increase the chances of a quick capitulation by Tajikistan, it does also introduce significant logistical challenges, particularly concerning those pretty substantial supply lines that are going to be required to sustain such a large force. And based on the calculations we have here, again, due to the fact that Uzbekistan hasn't prioritized the kind of logistical equipment and support systems you would need for a run like this, the Uzbeks can probably only maintain this sort of tempo for maybe a week or 2, likely having to scale down the amount of troops going on the offensive or begin prioritizing which force is actually making gains at any point. And that would bring us pretty much to our first strikes. So with the Uzbek forces in position along the border and an all-out offensive against Tajikistan being committed to before the first armoured columns cross the border, much like the Tajik scenario we talked about, a series of airstrikes will be carried out. And in the Uzbek scenario, we're likely to also see small groups of commandos or special forces begin to covertly infiltrate Tajikistan and conduct a series of specialized operations, their objectives being things like including Tajik power and communications infrastructure, securing key crossroads and checkpoints, and, if possible, attacking key supply and ammunition points, as well as gathering critical intelligence on the state of the Tajik defenses ahead of the main thrust. The more overt commencement of the invasion, though, is likely to be signaled by some pretty significant artillery and airstrikes, and, much like the Tajik scenario, aiming for the same sort of command and control centers. But here's where things get really complicated when trying to invade Tajikistan, as if we look at the 10 most likely priorities for airstrikes, over half of them are likely to be jointly operated with the Russians. So if you strike them, you're likely going to kill Russians. And remembering back to the parameters for our scenario, it means that Uzbek pilots are likely not going to be authorized to strike key centers like Aini Air Base, some of the central communication hubs, or even some of the Tajiks' key air defense structures, allowing them to fire back at the Uzbeks, whilst the Uzbeks can never be sure if they'll accidentally kill Russians by firing at them. Now, these initial airstrikes, because the Uzbek Air Force is so much larger than the Tajiks, are expected to be pretty significant, and there are still a number of targets that will do some pretty serious damage to the Tajiks, particularly in the north. But while Uzbekistan would be expected to achieve some air superiority over Tajikistan in at least the initial days of the campaign, several challenges are anticipated to pretty quickly emerge and intensify as these air operations progress. For one, the Uzbek air and air defense forces, who we're just going to call the Uzbek Air Force for now, are likely to incur some pretty serious losses to their fixed-wing and rotary-wing fleets after the initial wave of strikes. After all, once everyone knows you're coming and knows you're at war, well, they're going to start passing out all the shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles and start positioning themselves in the hills and mountains overlooking the approaches. Because here's the thing, when it comes to Dushanbe, for Uzbekistan there isn't really many angles they can actually approach Dushanbe from, because Dushanbe actually sits effectively at the crossroads of a bunch of valleys. So for Uzbekistan, if they're looking at the Uzbek border towards Dushanbe, there are tall mountains to the left and tall mountains to the right. There is only really one angle of advance, an angle that gets even narrower as you have to cross the Hisor River, and there's actually only a few bridges to cross, meaning that for the Tajiks and Russians, they know the Uzbeks have to advance through a corridor that's just 8 kilometers wide. So all of a sudden that massive numerical advantage ends up being bottlenecked on the approach to Dushanbe. So on top of these hills now being full of anti-aircraft weapons, a lot of the Uzbek airframes still in use were actually inherited from the Soviet Union, and therefore are quite old and require some pretty frequent repair. So if the Uzbeks are hoping to keep any substantive tempo of operations up here, they're going to have to repair these planes again and again. And the trouble is that Uzbekistan actually no longer has the capacity to repair these airplanes in the way they need, meaning that once those airplanes need repairs or have been structuring a sortie, they're going to need to be packed up and shipped all the way to Belarus, a CSTO ally of Tajikistan, for repair. So it's pretty unlikely they're ever going to come back before the end of the war, meaning that for Uzbekistan, as soon as anything gets hit, it's effectively out of action until the end of the war. Again, it doesn't matter how good the pilots are, these are just fundamentals built into the system that are going to affect the outcome of war. Derek, what impact do you think that's going to have?
Yes, some of the Uzbek fleet has been in Belarus for modernization fairly recently. So those would be some of their MiG-29s and Su-27s. So we can assume that those ones at least are in good working order, although that was a few years ago. But the question is, how long can they sustain air operations? So if they come out, and I would imagine they would at the onset of this conflict, they would come out very, very hard. They would want to neutralize as many air defense sites as they could, especially around the capital, Dushanbe. but then it's a distance that they have to fly to be able to return to their air bases. They, of course, they'll run exercises, but they don't do a whole lot of this in general. So they're going to start exhausting munitions. I don't know how much air launch munitions Uzbekistan has been stockpiling, particularly considering that they don't have a whole lot of these type of wars that they fight. So they might not be as prepared for that. And then, of course, it's a lot of stress on their airframes. And even though they've modernized their equipment, a lot of what they're running is still built 20, 30 years ago.
So these first strikes happen, and the Uzbeks have crossed the border from both the west, the north, and the east, and are racing toward Hujand, and the south racing toward Dushanbe. But directly in the middle of the path between the Uzbek border and at the very west of Dushanbe is also the massive Russian 201st base, meaning that Uzbek troops will now either need to fire upon those bases or bottleneck themselves even further to try and maneuver around them. And pretty quickly, just through basic geography, we can see how that Uzbek numerical advantage continues to shrink and shrink and shrink. Derek, how much of an impact do you think this has on their targeting decisions?
So it's an interesting one to speculate because, of course, especially if they go into the south, which is where the capital is, so that's a natural objective for them to want to go ahead and take. They start running into the Russian 201st military base. And that's a real X factor with this conflict because, number one, the Russians do have their own air defense systems there. Moscow's intent here would be very difficult to decipher, but I think certainly if there was any risk that Russian troops were going to come under fire, I think there's a strong risk that they could become involved in this. And I don't think Uzbekistan would want to find itself in a war with Russia or even, in a situation where they're having to bomb Russian positions. It's going to weigh on your ability to hit their air bases. It's going to weigh on your confidence to carry out strikes on a facility just for the pure risk of they don't know for sure where 201st personnel might be. Then they can identify the general bases, but there's a strong risk that you can hit something like that, especially from the air. From the ground, effectively, whatever's shooting at you, you can shoot back at, and that makes it a little more straightforward. But from the air, if they're, for example, if they're flying over the capital, some air defense system is tracking them. Well, is that air defense system, is it Russian? Is it Tajik? Is it joint operated by the two of them? What is it? And is it a threat? That it makes that sort of conflict a lot more heavily political, especially if it's in the south. The 201st doesn't have as big of a standing presence in the north, since a lot of its concern is, number one, securing the capital and then also securing the border against Afghanistan. So I think operations in the north would be a lot more straightforward if Uzbekistan were to go that way. Certainly in the south, which is where the real prize is, the capital, I think that's where it gets very, very dangerous.
So let's take a look at the north first. So for the Tajiks, they don't actually have that many troops up in the north. But what they do have up here are some pretty decent troops, including a separate air assault brigade, the 6th Motor Rifle Brigade, some border forces, some internal troops, and some National Guard guys that are pretty good as well. But recognizing their numerical disadvantage, and that in the north they're likely to be surrounded on multiple sides, Tajik forces would have the choice to either retreat back into the hills, or simply withdraw from their positions back into the city, where they can try and use the river in the north, and the radioactive waste disposal site in the west of the city to at least try and form some sort of bottlenecks. The aim here being that by concentrating their defenses on these choke points and back into the city, they can try and prevent more of the mobile Uzbek armor units from outflanking them or surrounding them, or instead force them to commit to intense urban fighting battles. Fighting amongst narrow streets with the Uzbek tanks would be significantly more vulnerable, a technique that a lot of the Tajik officers currently in command would have used to great success during the Tajik Civil War, with the leadership of Dushanbe probably making the calculation that time would be on the Tajik side, because the longer this war goes on, the more international pressure will end up being placed onto Uzbekistan. So with the Tajik forces abandoning their positions around the city and pulling back into Khujand and the adjoining Chklovsk, by this stage Uzbek casualties on both fronts are likely to remain relatively low, as the advancing columns are probably only facing resistance from some of the border forces and some rearguard troops simply hoping to buy some time. But moving this many men along this wider front is going to be consuming a lot of materials. And whilst during peacetime the Uzbeks' armoured vehicles rarely undertake such long distance travel under their own power, instead typically relying on rail transport for most of their journey, it's probably going to mean that as a result, a lot of the Uzbeks' older tanks and IFVs are going to struggle with the demands now being placed on them, meaning there's going to be lots of breakdowns, ongoing shortages of fuel trucks, and engineering vehicles to try and keep everyone moving. and by the time the Uzbek commander's probably reached the outer edge of Khajand, he's likely to have somewhere around 20 to 30% of his vehicles in need of some pretty serious repairs. Which, in other words, is likely to force an operational pause, with the Uzbeks now surrounding and overlooking the city. Now, an operational pause can be quite useful. Uzbek field commanders can use a few crucial days to procure and fit spare parts for damaged vehicles. They can provide some of the less experienced units with some much needed rest. They can begin establishing some smaller frontline stockpiles of key munitions, and also wait for some of the rest of the supply lines to catch up, as particularly when it comes to fronts like the southern front, their supplies are still coming from a long way away. With the situation being that if the Uzbeks have, let's say, reached the western edge of Dushanbe, their nearest very large supply hubs are going to be in places like Kakheti and Termez, with Termez being the only one of those two with the large facilities for unloading and loading trains, meaning that it's highly likely that even if massive amounts of ammunition and stockpiles are brought up from other parts of the country, they'd need to be unloaded off of a truck in Termez, in the very south of Uzbekistan, and then driven 250 kilometers to the front line in Dushanbe, all whilst hoping not to be attacked whilst they do this. So whilst the Uzbeks are sitting at the edge of these cities, refitting, refueling, and preparing for the push in, it also does afford the Tajik defenders a bunch of additional days to better prepare defenses, build fortified points throughout the city, arm some of the civilians in the city, and probably most importantly, continue to make pleas and cries to the Russians and other international actors to convince the Uzbeks to call off their assault. So if you were in this position, would you stop there at the edge of the capital, or would you try and just push straight in?
I think it would be wise for them to take their time to refuel. I mean, there is always the political timer, obviously, as we talked about with Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. There may still be a political timer where they have a specific set of time frame that they need to accomplish this in. But given their numerical superiority, and given the fact that I don't think there's any risk of a Tajik counterattack, especially in the north, the reinforcement, the cavalry is not coming, right? There's nothing else that's going to be backing the Tajik troops that are up there. Nobody's coming to relieve them. So there's no need to push your troops further than they should be, to push your vehicles further than they should go in a given time frame.
Now, this brings us to our real X factor in the decision here, as whilst arguing things like how many fuel trucks someone has, or the most likely avenue of an advance, are all fairly straightforward quantifiable things, the international response is not only the thing that will make or break this war, but is also the most contentious. So we had to speak to a lot of different political experts on this region, and then from there, take their consensus on how they'd react. Now, going with the most consensus approach, in the event of a surprise Tajik invasion by Uzbekistan, we can safely say that numerous international actors are likely to be highly critical of Tashkent's actions, with many probably calling for an immediate ceasefire. Influential actors such as Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, India, Iran, and China are all likely to begin exerting pressure behind the scenes on their contacts within the Uzbek administration to try and end this conflict, or at very least, agree to enter into negotiations with Dushanbe. Now, for the Central Asian states in particular, an invasion of this nature would likely cause significant financial and reputational damage, and deterring foreign investment in Central Asian markets. As from personal experience, I can tell you one of the major reasons that mining companies do tend to invest in this region is they're fairly stable and they don't tend to go to war with each other, making it fairly appealing for very long-term investments. But if you have large-scale wars breaking out in the region, well, a lot of that investment is going to start disappearing. So all of these states have a massive incentive to make sure that these sort of wars don't break out, and if they do, they resolve very quickly. And at this point in the scenario, the kind of rapid acquisitions that Russia got in 2014, or how quickly the war turned in 2008, are likely to be pretty far outside what the Uzbeks feel is achievable. And now the Uzbeks know they're probably in for a longer campaign, slogging it through the cities. Now, no matter how many times we played it, much of the Uzbek campaign strategy always seems to hinge on whether they can conclude the war within a 3-day window, with the significance of this 72-hour mark being that period typically represents the point international groups and alliances often begin to issue joint statements or announce sanctions packages, or initiate some sort of armed responses to some sort of events. And therefore, in this hypothetical exercise, if the war hasn't been won in 3 days, now they have to deal with international consequences. Now, Moscow in particular has a very good relationship with Uzbekistan, but also seems to be the most likely candidate to be the strong advocate for a coordinated regional response to this event. As if Moscow can pull together some sort of joint agreement among these regional partners, it would not only bolster Moscow's image within the region, as well as how international partners would see Moscow's position in the region. but it would also provide the other Central Asian leaders, who all have incentive to bring this conflict to a close as quickly as possible, a unified front for implementing these measures against Uzbekistan, with actors like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan able to effectively say, well, we're under Russian pressure to do that, rather than take on the blame after the conflict. Now again, this is where things can get the most fuzzy, but generally we would expect Russia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan to jump on board with this, with China and Iran effectively acting as maybes, which for Uzbekistan would mean the only borders they have open to them are with Turkmenistan, which does very little trade with Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan, which mostly just receives goods from Uzbekistan rather than sending it to them. Now, the several measures we can see being implemented at the 72-hour mark would be things like temporary closures of their borders with Uzbekistan, increased security along their borders with Tajikistan, as whilst, yes, they are the victims in this scenario, they're likely want to make sure that there isn't a refugee crisis coming into their countries. There'd also be a suspension of all military sales to Uzbekistan, again, which won't affect things in the first few days, but will definitely signal to Uzbekistan that a long-term conflict is off the cards, as Russia is still a major military supplier. There's also likely to be a temporary halt of all flights between their countries and Uzbekistan, which again, with Uzbekistan relying on 22% of its GDP coming from remittances, is going to be problematic. And a pause and review of all joint development projects within Uzbekistan. Again, these are things that would be very easy to roll back if Uzbekistan decides to behave themselves or pull back over the border, but if continued to roll out, will have some pretty disastrous effects on their long-term investment. Now, from the people we spoke with, all of those were pretty universally agreed upon. And whilst still the largest category, there were some of the people we interviewed who also suggested that Russia would be willing to push even further if need be, likely issuing a warning that if military actions had not been halted at the 120-hour mark, or if Tashkent had failed to initiate ceasefire negotiations with Dushanbe, Moscow may even consider additionally implementing things like a review and consideration of rolling back all visa-free travel for Uzbeks, which is something Russia really doesn't want to do, but would send shockwaves and likely cause riots and protests immediately in Tashkent. Russia also has the option to increase the deportations of illegally employed Uzbeks residing in Russia, effectively agitating and annoying a lot of Uzbeks, riling them up and telling them it's your government's fault for doing this, and then sending them right back to Tashkent, where the climate is probably already a bit of a powder keg. They could halt all outbound financial transactions between Russian and Uzbek banks. Again, that's going to put massive pressure on the Uzbek government from the upper echelons of society. They could also look at a reassessment of the purchasing price of Uzbek cotton, gas, and minerals, which again, in the very short term, is likely to send shockwaves through some of the markets, but in the long term could also cause problems. And whilst very few of the people we interviewed suggest that Russia be willing to announce this, there is always the possibility for the preparation for a deployment of intervening Russian peacekeeping forces, although I think that's probably less likely. The important thing is that all of these measures require pretty minimal effort from these initial states, but could all be pretty easily justified on the grounds of security concerns, and whilst only causing small problems for guys like Kazakhstan, would be absolutely immediate and devastating for Uzbekistan. For the average Uzbek citizen, the closure of these borders would not only push up the price of consumer goods, form some pretty nasty black and grey markets, and probably trigger panic buying across the country as well. And whilst I don't doubt that there will be a portion of the Uzbek population that will have the rally around the flag effect, there'll be a whole bunch else who see the war as a waste of young men and the reason that their groceries probably just tripled or quadrupled in price. And Russian Telegram channels now being flooded with messages saying that the moment they step back, all the prices go back to normal. Meaning that even if the Uzbeks keep making progress on the battlefield, they're going to start losing ground in the major Uzbek cities. And you can start to see pretty quickly how these international actors can have a massive impact on the conflict without having to actually fire a shot or supply either side with arms, mostly because of the unique circumstances of this area, where both Uzbekistan and Tajikistan in the last scenario are so reliant on Russian remittances and the Russians to keep their economy going. So Derek, which countries do you think would be most likely to buy into this?
Looking at the players one by one, Kazakhstan, which you mentioned, I think would find this very, very threatening. If you look at population centers, many of them are in the south. A significant number of them are close enough to the Uzbek border where even if Kazakhstan's not necessarily worried about Uzbekistan repeating this into Kazakhstan's territory, now that you've seen them do it, the risk is that, okay, well, what happens if they find themselves successful and they say, great, where else can we do this? And start looking at some of Kazakhstan's territory. Not only that, it flies in the face of a lot of what the Central Asian states have tried to do over the last few decades, which has been slow but painful coordination between the five, at times very haltingly, at times, a lot of setbacks and not getting very far. But certainly this kind of behavior would fly right in the face of a lot of what they've attempted to do, which is to build trust and confidence between the countries of the region. As far as what I don't believe Kazakhstan would want to take a hard approach to this. I don't think they'd start deploying troops to get involved, but I think they would certainly put a lot of pressure on Russia to get itself involved. Now, Russia, as we discussed, is a CSTO member, or is the head of the CSTO effectively, and Tajikistan is a CSTO member. In theory, this should trigger the collective defense clauses of the CSTO. In theory. Now, Russia could play its cards awkwardly with this, but my belief would be they wouldn't see any real benefit to the Uzbeks coming in and capturing Dushanbe. If anybody else other than the Tajiks are controlling Dushanbe, the Russians would probably prefer it to be themselves. Plus, there's, of course, the operational risk to their own soldiers. Russia, of course, has a lot of tools to work with against Uzbekistan, at least tools, though, that are in country. Uzbekistan's size will dwarf the 201st. But I don't believe Uzbekistan would want to bite off a fight with the Russians, knowing that, number one, Russia's not going to forget that. And Russia has a lot more soldiers, a lot more equipment, and a lot more modern equipment that they could work with to really impose costs on Uzbekistan. Lastly would be China. I think China would just see this overall as just a net negative for them. Central Asia is an area of investment for them. It's also, it being their Western neighborhood, China would like to see this area remain as stable as possible. That's why they've quietly put some border posts in Tajikistan itself. The last thing they want to see is these countries going in, toppling each other, destroying infrastructure, causing all sorts of chaos. Because all that's going to invite is especially problems south of the Tajik border. It's going to invite Afghanistan's problems to spill across the border if these governments aren't in a position to defend themselves.
And it's this point here that the Uzbeks effectively have to decide between one of two options. Option A being to intensify the war effort and attempt to seize the cities by force. Now, if the Uzbeks were determined to press on with the war, knowing that these sanctions and economic problems are only going to get worse over the next days and months, well, now they're going to have to fight a prolonged, nasty urban campaign through both these cities, with supply lines that, particularly on the southern front, can run as far as 250 kilometers back to the nearest major hub. Now, in the report that will be published in a few weeks, there is a play-by-play on how these cities be taken, but in short, it is theoretically possible that the Uzbeks could probably take Khujand, but Dushanbe, effectively, unless they're willing to commit another 3 or 4 brigades to this, is effectively off the cards. It's just too big a city, and Uzbek forces aren't really trained for the kind of house-to-house fighting that you'd likely need to carry out, destroying most of the city as you do it. And the kind of fighting they would have to carry out is also likely to kill a lot of civilians. And the moment you start killing that many civilians, you're also likely to draw more international attention to yourselves. And whilst the Russian economy can effectively limp on after sanctions, the Uzbek economy really doesn't have that ability. After all, they're double landlocked, and almost every country that gives them an entryway is either Turkmenistan, an effective North Korea hermit state themselves, or Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, who have both just shut the border on you. If sanctions are put on Uzbekistan, they are really going to bite. So here's the thing. Let's say they did actually take Khujand. They're willing to undertake a massive amount of casualties, and probably somewhere around the 2 to 4 week mark, they finally conquer the city, and therefore pretty much capture the north, effectively the ears of the rabbit. Well, the next question to be asked would be, okay, well, now what? If Khujand is finally captured, potentially at the cost of 5 to 10,000 Uzbek soldiers, would Tashkent be prepared to replenish those forces in the north to carry out into the occupation phase, and then push those forces that have just won the battle up there down to the south to go fight in Dushanbe? Because none of the Uzbek gear is really designed to fight for very long campaigns. And on top of all this, if these exhausted units now being moved from the north to the south are given the time to reassemble at the edge of Dushanbe, and then with the forces that were there before and these additional forces make a massive new push into the city, is Tashkent willing to lose another 10 to 15,000 people to go take the city? Again, that's a lot of casualties and a lot of angry families and mothers, not only seeing large casualty numbers coming back from the front, but are also seeing messages on the telegram that the moment they overthrow this government, all of this goes away, which is a pretty big incentive to do so. However, the most terrifying thing for Uzbek planners, though, would be what happens if the Dushanbe government escapes? What happens if Rahmon and his government pull back to places like his hometown in Dangara, or they pull back into the foothills in Kolob, or they even pull back into the Rasht Valley, places that over history have proven almost impossible to dislodge defenders from? Is Uzbekistan willing to spend the time, effort, and resources to try and dislodge them from these mountains? Or are they going to find themselves being struck by ambushes from these mountains the entire time? All of this is a very, very long campaign to commit to, and frankly, not that much gain that, as well, no one is ever going to recognize. None of these Central Asian states have any incentive to recognize the Uzbeks' gains. And whilst, because you've surrounded Hujand, you might be able to capture the government there, because of only being able to advance on Dushanbe from one side effectively, it's incredibly easy for the government to flee into the mountains, turning what could have been maybe you win the next big push into a prolonged guerrilla warfare. A type of conflict a lot of this government actually has experience in fighting as well. So if the Uzbeks are sitting there at the day 4 mark, with all these announcements being made and the commanders waiting for the orders to go into the city, do they pull the trigger on that? Because that's the other option, is that they effectively sit put and start negotiating from that moment, saying, hey, we've taken all this ground, this was a wake-up call, and both sides can agree to something token for the Uzbeks to then pull out with some dignity. Which actually, in most cases, we found to be the most likely scenario, because frankly, it's the most logical scenario. Meaning that the most likely scenario is this massive push that reaches the edge of these cities, negotiations start, and the Uzbeks pull back over the border afterwards, probably towing a whole bunch of their vehicles with them. Because, as we've seen, unless Uzbekistan can take these cities by day 3, conquer the country and effectively have everyone go, well, it's too late to do anything, their reliance on international partners means they really can't keep that war going for much longer. As with each extra day of conflict, increases the chance of domestic rebellion. And this kind of brings us to the key findings from this exercise. Is what we found is, for Uzbekistan, even though they do have this much, much larger military, for them, peace actually remains the most economically, strategically, and reputationally advantageous option for both sides, particularly as both administrations' current strategic doctrines prioritize the continuation of regional trade and domestic stability above all else. And this is pretty antithetical to both of those. Now, if Uzbekistan was to launch this massive invasion and then try and go into peace negotiations in day 3, well, they might be able to secure slightly better water rights terms than what Dushanbe may have been willing to offer without it. However, any improvements in these terms are unlikely to compensate for the lives lost, the severe risks that are associated with launching such an operation in the first place, the reputational damage done to the region, and the amount of vehicles and supplies you've just burnt through for the Uzbek army's long weekend holiday away in Tajikistan. So that was our first key finding, that frankly, peace is actually the better option for all sides here. The second being that Russia has a pretty massive influence in the direction of this conflict, even if it chooses not to get involved directly, as not only is it such a big part of both the Uzbek and Tajik economies, that it can exert pretty big pressure on either side, but we even had to make a special rule at the start of the game because the Russians could really quickly end it. See, what we found is the moment the Uzbeks do cross the border, and the surprise caveat no longer applies, from them, all it takes is the Russians to effectively move their vehicles out of their bases in the west of Dushanbe, drive westward for around 20 minutes, and establish themselves on the bridges over the Hisor River. Again, there's only a few bridges, and it's only an 8-kilometer gap. And the moment the Russians do so, it pretty much ends up being game over for the Uzbek team. There's not much else they can do. From there, they either have to fire up on the Russians, effectively breaking the game or going to war with Russia, or effectively turn around and go home, falling 17 kilometers short of Dushanbe, which is a pretty strong position for Russia to be in, and fairly logical for Moscow to do if the conflict were to break out. Now, the third of our key findings is that the Uzbek army is definitely not ready for such a logistically complex operation, as whilst the Uzbeks are very good at moving their troops around the country, and even getting over some of the choke points existing within Uzbekistan, they're as effective as they are because they A, have access to their own rail networks, B, aren't seeing their rear areas being targeted by drones or insurgents, and C, can also use things like friendly fuel stations without having to worry about that fuel being tainted or columns being targeted. So as impressive as the Uzbek army is within its own borders, these sort of items and equipment it's been purchasing over the years really hasn't set it up to launch an invasion of this scale. And our last key finding is effectively that, again, their armed forces aren't trained for large-scale conventional warfare. Whilst the Uzbek army did get trained for a lot of large maneuver warfare tactics back during the Cold War, preparing for large-scale battles on the plains of Europe against the capitalists, today the Uzbeks are mostly trained in things like crowd control, insurgency fighting, and counter-terrorism operations. So asking these forces to enter into dense, room-by-room, house-by-house fights with the Tajiks is probably a step too far and probably something they're really not equipped to do, and is almost certain to bring back some very, very high casualty numbers, which again goes against the central tenet of what Uzbekistan's doctrine is, which is all about domestic stability. So all up, whilst Uzbekistan has this much larger army, due to geography and these sorts of equipment they've been purchasing over the years, there is very little chance of victory in this scenario. And whilst it is, yes, theoretically possible that Uzbekistan could take and occupy the north of Tajikistan, it's absolutely nowhere near worth it. And if they did try to launch a southern campaign toward Dushanbe, and by some miracle the international community did not sanction them, taking Dushanbe would be incredibly difficult, but taking the mountains and valleys outside of Dushanbe would be frankly a nightmare. With many of these mountain passes more difficult and more defender-friendly than some of the most difficult terrain in Afghanistan. The deeper the Uzbeks be forced into Tajikistan, the worse that campaign would get. And so looking at this, the obvious best answer for Uzbekistan here, despite them having a massive military, is peace. A theme which is also somewhat present in our third scenario. And now that we've got Uzbekistan out of the way, let's move to that one.
Part 3. The Nightmare in the North. A Russian invasion of Kazakhstan.
So our third and final scenario here is looking at a Russian invasion of northern Kazakhstan. A scenario that neither military is really preparing for, but one that we hear about more often than any of the other ones. So Derek, why do you think that is? Why do we hear so much about this particular scenario?
Every so often, you'll get the propagandists that go on Russian state media, and they'll go ahead and they'll say, oh, by the way, there's all these ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan. We had this exact same motive to go into Ukraine. In theory, the idea was we're defending ethnic Russians in Ukraine. They're being abused, yada, yada, yada. They could easily make that exact same argument and go into Kazakhstan, regardless of whether it's true or not. So it is atypical for Kazakhstan to have that threat, and that actually has prompted Kazakh government pushback when those guys make those sort of statements.
Which makes the actual border arrangements quite odd, as if you look at where the major Kazakh and Russian bases are in this area, it tells a completely different story. Because frankly, there aren't that many major Kazakh military facilities near that northern section of the border. And this sent us down a bit of a rabbit hole, as when you first start looking at military maps between these two countries, things do look a little strange, particularly when you start looking around these two areas of focus. These being the two cities here in northern Kazakhstan with the highest concentration of Russian populations. The first being Petropavl, approximately 100 kilometers south of the border, and the second being Pavlodar, a city about 600 kilometers southeast of Petropavl that also sits only about 100 kilometers away from the Russian border, with Russians making up around 59% of the population in Petropavl and around 47% of the population in Pavlodar. Which for context, the Russians only ever made up around 38% of the population of the Donbass region in Ukraine, according to a census conducted prior to the 2014 invasion. So, admittedly, some of the same warning signs are there. And then when you go a little bit further into this and start examining the Russian military bases in the area, the situation also looks pretty daunting for the Kazakhs, as on the Russian side of the border, there are several substantial military installations in the area, in places like Omsk, Yekaterinburg, Chelyabinsk, Novosibirsk, and Voitenburg, all stationed very close to the Kazakh border. Well, and then you might ask, what does Kazakhstan have on their side of the border in preparation for this? And the answer is, well, not really a lot. Now, part of this is due to the fact that Kazakhstan's military budget is significantly smaller than the Russians. And looking at the 2023 figures, Russia's budget is roughly 50 times larger than that of Kazakhstan's. Although admittedly, the war in Ukraine does kind of fudge those numbers, as military spending tends to go up when you're trying to conquer Ukraine 1 inch at a time. But even when we look a bit deeper into it, and take a look at where the Kazakh military is deployed, things don't look particularly encouraging for the Kazakhs there either. As while Russia has all these large military bases along the northern frontier, Kazakhstan actually doesn't have very much in the north. Let's take Petropavl as our example here, as the only real military presence Kazakhstan has permanently deployed in the city are just a handful of small barracks for some of its internal troops, and the National Guard Training School for Unit 6637. Again, a very small unit, really not equipped to fight tanks or heavy weaponry. And taking a look at Pavlodar, the situation there is even less favourable, with the Kazakhs having very little in the way of military deployment ready to go. In fact, the nearest major Kazakh military bases are located in Astana, which is also the capital of the country, about 500 kilometers to the south of Petropavl. And the other major deployment in this area would be in Semey, approximately 300 kilometers south of Pavlodar, meaning that there's effectively, for either 300 or 500 kilometers, no major Kazakh military bases in the area. So Derek, why would the Kazakhs be set up like this? What are they hoping to achieve here?
But so it's very atypical for them to not have troops along there. Well, the problem is if you start heavily stalking that border, it starts to look like you don't treat this guy like a friend. And that might, from the Russian perspective, they might get the wrong impression and then say, oh, well, maybe we should be, trying to launch something here. Maybe we should be trying to cause issues here.
So speaking with a lot of experts for this project and reviewing many of the documents around this disparity of forces along the border between the two states actually probably more comes down to a few fairly understandable factors. Not wanting to upset Russia is one of them, but we'll come back to that one. As if we look at the Russian side of the border and these massive concentrations of troops, yeah, it does look a bit daunting and like they are preparing for an invasion, but it actually makes more sense when you realize that most of these forces are stationed near major population centers or along the Trans-Siberian Railway, as Russian troops often rely on railways for moving supplies and equipment around. So naturally, these deployments tend to follow along those same logistical routes. It also really doesn't fit with the theory that these bases are there to prepare for an invasion of Kazakhstan, when most of them were built either during the Second World War or directly afterwards. Okay, so that might explain why there's so many Russian troops on that side of the border, but why are there so little troops on the Kazakh side of the border? Now, obviously there's probably going to be lots more factors, but the most likely factor seems to simply be budgetary constraints, as Kazakhstan still almost universally completely relies on facilities and bases that have been built by the Soviets decades ago. As why build an entire new military base when there's one just sitting there doing nothing anyway, when the money you'd spend to do that can be used for a whole bunch of other projects that desperately need to be fixed first. I'm looking at you, most of Kazakhstan's rural plumbing. And obviously, if we're only using Soviet-era bases, well, Moscow didn't build a lot of bases along the northern frontier of the Kazakh SSR, which kind of makes sense. It was all part of one country at the time, and frankly, there was already plenty of Russian troops stationed just to the north of it. Okay, well that would make sense why there's no historical bases there, but why then would Kazakhstan not remedy that situation considering they've been independent for over 30 years now? Well, here's where I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a Kazakh defense planner, as already they're working with a very, very limited and constrained budget, much of which is being used to maintain a lot of the old infrastructure. And not only is construction up here in the north of the country very expensive, so to build any brand new major military facilities in the area would not only be a pretty significant financial strain on the Kazakh military budget, but as Derek pointed out, would probably send the wrong signal to Russia as well. And even if they did invest in building one big large military base in somewhere like Petropavl, they'd still probably find themselves wildly outgunned by the Russians. So while things do look pretty daunting on a map, the lack of Kazakh military infrastructure along the northern frontier is likely more about historical Soviet planning and budget limitations than it is about, let's say, Russia applying direct pressure onto Kazakhstan to prevent them from going through with such development. And that brings us effectively to the beginning of our wargame scenario, this one being a little more realistic than the other two, not because we think it's likely, but because of how restrained the actual scenario is. Okay, so the scenario here sets up that Russia and Kazakhstan are experiencing a pretty significant low point in their relations. Maybe Kazakhstan is talking about leaving some of the Russia-led organizations, or maybe Gerasimov's just got the map the wrong way round. But regardless, that's not important for this scenario. What's important is things take a turn for the worse, and Russia decides it could benefit from asserting its force in Kazakhstan. Now, to explore the playbook behind this hypothetical assault, we can draw a little bit from the Russian playbook in the Donbass, as nationalists use a lot of the same talking points for that as they have for Kazakhstan. Now, the scenario focuses on these two towns we talked about earlier on, Petropavl and Pavlodar, positing that effectively riots break out in both these cities, whether those riots be stoked by external forces or whether occurring naturally, and the Russian nationalists seize on these riots and report them as attacks on Russian citizens, using this as a pretext to send troops into northern Kazakhstan, stating that there might not be an adequate amount of Kazakh police in the area to be able to adequately protect its own citizens. Again, these are some of the excuses that we used in the Donbass, so it's not completely out of the question the Russians do it again. Now, this situation is also helped by the fact that Russian troops crossing into Kazakhstan is not actually unprecedented. In fact, it was a Russian-led CSTO force that helped put down the unrest in most of Kazakhstan's major cities, and keep the current president, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, in power during the events of 2022. And additionally, Kazakhstan will occasionally turn toward Russia for assistance during wildfires, floods, and other disasters, with the Kazakh and Russian forces often cooperating between each other and providing mutual assistance in the area, even if that means Russian troops crossing into Kazakhstan or Kazakhstan troops crossing into Russia. So again, this here may not set off as many alarm bells as many people think. Now, whether Russia seeks permission from Kazakhstan before it crosses the border, or frankly just forces its way across, the lack of major military bases here in both Petropavl and Pavlodar means the Russian troops will pretty likely move into both cities relatively bloodlessly. And it's highly probable that once inside, they'd set up temporary command centers in government buildings and establish roadblocks in and out of the city, likely just using the riots as a precedent to do so. Again, all of these movements are actually not that far off what Russia has done in the past, usually using personnel from the Ministry of Emergency Situations. This just being much larger in scale, much more aggressive, and not having permission of the Kazakh government to do so. Now, much like the seizure of Crimea or the initial takeover of parts of the Donbass by Russia, Moscow would be aiming for this operation to be as quick and bloodless as possible. The calculation likely being that moving in under a reasonable pretext, and again, the strongest quotations around that one, would likely reduce the resistance from the Kazakh forces as they transit that roughly 100 kilometers between the border and these cities. And by going in under this pretext, does give some plausible deniability to states like China or the Central Asian republics to not get too involved on this one. Now, the real challenge isn't what happens on day one. Russia's established itself in the city, it's set up roadblocks, and Russian personnel are now controlling and maintaining curfews across the city. The real challenge for Astana here will probably come at around day 3 of the scenario. And by then, everything's under control, the streets have returned to normal, and the immediate crisis appears to be over. And it's at that point that the Kazakh president would be picking up the phone with the Russian president and saying, okay, thanks for your help, we'll take it from here. Our scenario takes a turn though when Russia refuses to leave, with the Russian president stating that it doesn't believe that the Kazakhs can offer adequate protection to its citizens, and that Russia wants to stay here to guarantee their safety. This places Kazakhstan in a very difficult position, as they have to decide between effectively 3 options. The first being to mobilize some of their forces and begin moving them the 500 kilometers north from Astana toward these occupied cities. 2 would be effectively to surrender control of these cities to the Russians, something that most people in Kazakhstan would be pretty annoyed about. Or 3 would be to negotiate behind the scenes quietly with Moscow and try to convince them to withdraw quietly, arguing that Russia pulling back over the border averts any sort of political crisis and will prevent poisoning the well with China and the rest of the Central Asian republics. And what is interesting is that third option, being able to negotiate behind the scenes, and there being a possibility of Russia just pulling back over the border, interestingly might actually be one of the advantages of Kazakhstan not having any large military deployments in the region. As when Russia pushed into Ukraine in 2022, well, that operation required pretty significant violence and resulted in many Russian and Ukrainian casualties. And with so many lives being lost in those early stages, it became much harder for both Moscow or Kiev to simply pick up the phone and try and negotiate some sort of withdrawal, without also facing massive public backlash for doing so. Now again, this is just a theory, but one that when we put it to our experts, seemed to either get the response that it was somewhere between plausible and correct, and there actually being far more debate on whether this was a deliberate strategy by Astana or just an unintended byproduct of budgetary constraints. The theory being that because Kazakhstan doesn't keep a large troop presence here in the north, specifically in these northern cities that would be the most likely candidates for an invasion of this type, that if Russia were to have this moment of madness and ever try and cross the border and occupy areas of Kazakhstan, even after a few days of the occupation, the situation would actually still involve pretty minimal casualties, likely being only a few losses on either side. And unlike the situation in the Donbass or in Ukraine, actually does leave that third option on the table to negotiate, as once too many people have been killed, it becomes much harder for both sides to come to the table. Who could either still be in Astana 500 kilometers to the south, or having relocated to Kazakhstan's largest city Almaty 12,500 kilometers away, does technically still have that option on the table to effectively pick up the phone and say, look, you made your point, we understand, now I think it's time for you to leave, and appeal to the Russians that by pulling back over the border, not only would it allow the two to resolve this crisis without sparking any larger conflict between the two, or fuel the nationalists in the country into pushing the two leaders into positions they might not want to take, but would also prevent Russia from losing face and sowing some pretty serious distrust between them, China, Mongolia, and the other Central Asian states. Again, this is all just a theory and connecting a lot of dots here, but when looking at it, the logic does actually somewhat hold up. So Derek, I'm curious to know, how plausible do you think this scenario is?
The scenario that you laid out is something that is certainly, you can almost see how it would play out, where out of nowhere there's some protests, and then all of a sudden there's things getting firebombed at night, and then there's all this chaos. And you had this early in 2022 where there was a series of protests that got out of hand, and the CSTO actually deployed to that. Now, they assisted Kazakhstan, they mostly just secured infrastructure, and then the Kazakh troops kind of brought order to everything. But let's say you had a scenario pop out in these cities where all of a sudden there's rioting, there's problems, you get, a news story here or there that ethnic Russians have been hurt. Well, then Russia could go ahead and say, the CSTO should get involved, the CSTO should be deployed. These cities are out of control, you can't handle it. And if Kazakhstan says no, that's where the Russians could still go ahead and say, nope, we're taking control of this situation. Clearly, you're not able to defend ethnic Russians. They're being attacked by people. We're going to go in, we're going to handle this. And particularly given how lightly defended those are, they could probably waltz in without too much trouble.
And what are your thoughts about this theory that by not having massive deployments in the north of the country, that Kazakhstan does effectively still have that third emergency option on the table before having to commit to either war or surrender? What are your thoughts?
Exactly. It's avoiding some kind of casus belli for the war to just take a totality and just go after Kazakhstan in general. And now, of course, if this were to pop out, maybe Moscow's ultimate intent is to go all the way to Astana, in which case you can't avoid that war to begin with. But the idea would be, without provoking this into a massive conflict, you could even see them take sort of the Russian perspective and say, okay, we understand that these issues were here. Thank you very much for helping us restore security, and try to de-escalate it from there. That's obviously not going to be a very popular opinion, particularly if Kazakh troops were killed as a result of these advances. But it's at that stage, it may well still be possible for them to manage this and de-escalate it.
And once again, this is where geography kind of complicates things. But instead of it being mountains this time, here in Kazakhstan, it's more likely just the sheer size of the country, as the territory between Astana and Petropavl is effectively 500 kilometers of open, barren, flat steppe, meaning that the moment either side leaves their starting positions in Petropavl or Astana, the other side will be very aware of their movements and how long it'll take before they get there. And unlike Ukraine, where there's lots of towns, structures, and forests to provide cover and replenishment between those two cities, along this side of the country, there is incredibly little. And this is where Kazakhstan's deployments might give us another hint at this strategy, as both Astana and Karaganda, just at the south of Astana, house not only some of the country's most capable military units, such as the 36th Guards Air Assault Brigade in Astana and the 7th Motor Rifle Brigade in Karaganda, but they also contain some of Kazakhstan's best fighter planes, missile units, and anti-air defenses, making it pretty unlikely that the Russians could advance southward without facing significant resistance, as both sides understand that this long 500-kilometer march between Petropavl down to Astana, almost entirely along a single long highway, is likely to be a pretty costly and destructive endeavor, as there's nowhere to hide and a lot of missiles pointing in that direction. And even if either side attempted this, whether it be the Russians attempting to reach Astana, or the Kazakhs attempting to reach Petropavl, both sides know that that 500-kilometer march, as well as all of the logistics and vehicles that come with it, is only the beginning of the fight. As once they'd arrive at the edge of that city, they'd then need to face the challenge of digging in and preparing for an urban combat campaign, which again, to put it in context for you, looking at our previous scenarios, the advance from the Uzbek border to the edge of Dushanbe was less than 50 kilometers. And the scenario advancing from the Tajik border to Batken was less than 10. Here in Kazakhstan, we're looking at the beginning of the campaign being a 500-kilometer march. And to add another complication on top of that, if we were to look at the Russians' perspective, even if they believe they could capture Astana and they're happy to risk going down that highway, once they get anywhere close to that city, it's incredibly easy for the Kazakh government to simply pick up and relocate 1,250 kilometers to the south in Almaty. After all, the city used to be the capital of the country, and there's a huge amount of government infrastructure already in place there. And once the government does relocate, a Russian commander would be forced to ask themselves a critical question. Would they be willing to sustain a logistics chain over 2,000 kilometers in length to go chase the Kazakh government to the south of the country? Well, the likely answer is no. Taking Astana wouldn't end the war, and 2,000 kilometers is a logistical nightmare. The same kind of nightmare that has chewed up many people who've tried to invade Russia in the past. In other words, Kazakhstan gets to play the strategic depth card and Una reverse themselves onto Russia. So Derek, we know it'd be a real pain for the Russians to move any further south, but if you were advising the Kazakh government here, what would be your thoughts on attempting to push northward to try and retake Petropavl or Pavlodar?
The risk is that, let's say it was just a couple light Russian units that go into there. They're sufficient enough to take the city, but you as Kazakhstan, you look at it and you say, oh, we actually have the forces ready to go. We could actually take these back by force. Well, the moment you try, that's going to start expanding this war bigger and bigger. And it's going to, have the risk of drawing more Russian troops in. It'll take them a little bit to get there as they're flowing from elsewhere in the country. But ultimately, the numbers game here does not favor Kazakhstan one bit. Versus if you instead look at from the perspective of, well, we play to our geography, right? We play to our strengths. So Kazakhstan being a very, very big country, a lot of territory for them to have to travel. How far can that Russian force go? How far does it intend to go? And do you necessarily, as Kazakhstan, do you necessarily need to bring all of your forces, pool them all there? Or can you keep things more dispersed, especially knowing that more of your population centers are in the south anyway? Of course, the capital is not, but more of your population centers are in the south anyway. I don't want to say that you sort of accept the Russian presence, but it might make the defense of the rest of the country easier versus if you pull yourself into a massive engagement along those northern borders, trying to fight for every inch, and you suffer a big defeat there, that's much harder for Kazakhstan to absorb than it is for Russia.
So in other words, we're heading towards our key findings here. The big takeaway being that if Russia does intend to go any further than these cities, or even into these cities at all, it's a massive commitment by the Russian government, and one that risks destabilizing its relationships with a whole bunch of very key important partners. As if Russia is willing to go into it as friendly a nation as Kazakhstan, well, that puts the relationships with other countries in question as well. And it should always be pointed out that this is a very, very unlikely scenario, because whilst Kazakhstan hasn't fully supported Russia's war effort in Ukraine, it still remains a pretty steadfast partner of Russia, partly by choice and partly by geography, and due to a whole bunch of factors, including most of the railways heading in toward Russia, most of the pipe infrastructure heading toward Russia, a lot of the consumer goods coming in from Russia, as well as Moscow just being an important trade partner of Kazakhstan, all push these two states toward having better relations between them. As it is for Moscow, Kazakhstan provides Russia with a gateway into Central Asia, a whole bunch of very important minerals, materials, and a shortcut into the Chinese markets if need be. And whilst, yes, Tokayev, the current president of Kazakhstan, is arguably less aligned with Russia than his predecessor, Nazarbayev, he still works very closely and very well with the Russian government. After all, it's the Russian government that helped keep him in place in 2022. The reality is that Tokayev is likely aware that by pure geography, Kazakhstan is kind of locked into this delicate position. That if Russia were to come in and occupy these two cities, there aren't many other big players that Kazakhstan can turn to. For instance, if it were to go to Beijing and beg for help, China would be unlikely to want to pick a side here, unless it's absolutely necessary, as China conducts far more trade with Russia than it does with Kazakhstan, and would likely place its priority on making sure there is a peaceful and rapid resolution to any instability in the region, as this area of Kazakhstan is just over the border from China's Xinjiang region, an area that Beijing will go to massive lengths to make sure has no chance of instability. So if they can't rely on China to come to the rescue, what about the West? Well, unlike Ukraine, which could look to NATO and the Western allies for support when it was invaded, Kazakhstan is in a far less favourable geographic position. I mean, if you just recall the logistical challenges NATO faced in providing aid to Georgia during the 2008 war, imagine how much harder it's going to be to get support and weapons to Kazakhstan if Kazakhstan's at war with Russia. As we look around their borders, China is unlikely to be comfortable with NATO putting weapons in there. Kyrgyzstan's a CSTO ally of Russia. Uzbekistan relies heavily on Russia economically, and Turkmenistan is a nation which is constitutionally bound to keep neutral. And even if we look to the Caspian Sea, well, firstly, the Caspian Sea doesn't connect to any of the international waterways, so we're going to have to use one of the ports on the sea. And I don't really see Iran putting their hand up to help NATO anytime soon, meaning that all we have left is Azerbaijan. And right now, with Azerbaijan making a lot of money off re-exporting Russian gas, and still reliant on Russia for some of its military equipment and for a good chunk of its trade, I don't see Azerbaijan looking to burn that bridge anytime soon. Particularly as the fact that when it comes to the Caspian Sea, well, Russia really does still remain the dominant naval power out of the 5 navies, with Moscow being effectively the biggest kid in the Little League pool. As things stand, it would take a massive deviation from normal politics for this to ever even approach the point where Russia would feel like this is an option they have to take. That the risk of negative backlash toward Russia would be worth what they would gain from occupying these two cities. The only scenario I can possibly see that might push Russia down this path would be something like Kazakhstan announcing its intentions to join NATO, which in that case you might plausibly see Russia make moves to occupy these two cities, effectively creating a territorial dispute and making NATO membership negotiations between Kazakhstan and NATO nearly impossible. But Derek, how likely do you think it is that Kazakhstan would ever even receive an offer to join NATO, let alone reach out to NATO themselves?
I don't know if they would. Unlike in Ukraine, Kazakhstan's not going to have the West coming to provide them any substantial amount of armaments. You might get one or two Western countries that are willing to provide some sort of equipment, but it's not going to be anything like what Ukraine has received, which has actually allowed Ukraine to defend its territory. Kazakhstan is not in that sort of situation. So I think if you're them, you manage this in the best way possible to avoid any sort of escalation that would, despite the fact that, of course, your temper is going to be high because this is now Russian troops coming across a border that was internationally respected, all of that coming across on a nonsense prerogative. But you have to kind of manage this situation and look at it and say, okay, well, how do we prevent this from getting any worse?
As depressing as it may sound, the reality is that with these Central Asian militaries, and something we'll be covering a lot more in the other parts of this miniseries, is that while we tend to view Russia by its ability to successfully convert its tanks to scrap metal, here in Central Asia, the picture is a little bit different, as military budgets here in the region are so relatively small that even Russia's currently reduced presence still has some pretty significant impacts, and Moscow has the ability to put their thumb on a whole bunch of scales. On top of that, there's also the geography of the region, with most of the region's highways, railways, and infrastructure, much of it built during the Soviet era, all being designed to efficiently and effectively funnel goods and resources back from Central Asia toward the Russian heartland. In such a one-sided manner, it's as if Moscow built it that way, which they did. And what this comparative military strength and all this infrastructure does is really create a kind of built-in inertia for the region, particularly when it comes to the matters of defense and security. Now, that doesn't mean that things aren't changing in Central Asia. They absolutely are at the moment. You can really feel it when you're there on the ground. Particularly when you look at some of the younger people, every trip I take into the area now, I see less and less Russian influence in the country. But with that said, whilst these cultural shifts are definitely happening, economic and military transformations often take a lot longer to catch up, as it's often much easier to change an opinion than it is the direction of a mountain. In the end, my biggest takeaway from these three scenarios is actually how unlikely a full-scale war is here in Central Asia. As while there are nations like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, both of which are currently engaged in an arms race, it's an arms race for the kinds of equipment you'd use for a small border skirmish, or to push back an invasion from a neighbouring state. And it's not the sort of hardware that one would buy if they were planning to launch a large-scale invasion into a neighbouring state or occupy a large capital city. That's the thing about procurement. What you buy today is what you fight with in 5 years. And with none of these sides buying the kind of equipment that you need to launch an invasion like this, it seems that for at least the next few years, none of these states are actively preparing to really try and invade the other one. Even if we look at some of the larger militaries like Uzbekistan, most of Uzbekistan's past as well as their planned purchases are almost entirely focused on domestic control or preventing insurgencies coming in from Afghanistan rather than any sort of external aggression or peer rivalry. In fact, across all 5 states, the deeper trend that we are seeing is almost universally towards integration with one another, with the 5 Central Asian republics continuing to announce things like new visa arrangements, trade agreements, cross-border programs, better communication system, integrated power grids, and stronger cooperation between these 5 states. Hardly the kinds of actions you'd take if you were planning to invade your neighbouring state. And whilst running war games and simulations like this, even with some of the most experienced military and academic professionals we could have ever hoped for, can never really be an absolute prediction or tell us the exact outcomes of specific battles, or even the precise political climate that these battles occur in. What it did show us is how stacked the deck is against any invading force in this region. That for any of these 5 Central Asian presidents, if they were considering going and invading their neighbouring state, there is almost no way of going forward with it without taking on massive risk for a very low chance of payoff. With the only really logical way of getting what these states want instead being through diplomacy and integration programs. Our second scenario effectively started with Uzbekistan using force to get the water rights they want, something they had threatened in the past. But today, the two states just work together on this. Uzbekistan willing to provide more resources to Tajikistan in exchange for more water coming down the river, something that's much more achievable and has far less chance of going so horribly wrong like it did in our scenario. And to me, all of that sounds like a far better outcome than launching any of these conflicts would be. Thank you so much for checking out this episode. It is easily the longest piece we have ever put together here at the show, as it's the first one to push anywhere near the 2.5 hour mark. So we hope you enjoyed it and understand why it took a while to put together. Now, if you missed it at the beginning of this piece, or haven't caught the previous part of this miniseries, this is part 2 of our ongoing miniseries, The Armed Forces of Central Asia, with this series being put out as part of a much larger project, also called The Armed Forces of Central Asia. The project being effectively a comprehensive study of the 5 republics' military and security services. Now, this series has been put together in conjunction with a number of academic, governmental, and military organizations, and part 1 of the mini-series was put out a few months ago, taking a deep dive into the military structures and organizational charts, and unpacking how the Tajik military works. And since that piece has come out, we've also released the first chapter of this report, a full 180-page PDF examining the militaries and capabilities of the armed forces of Tajikistan, all of which you can find links for in the description below. In any case though, we hope you enjoyed the change of format. This was a pretty ambitious piece for us. But if Central Asia wasn't your thing, well, don't worry, we'll be returning with regular Redline episodes, and at a far more manageable length after this one, with the third and possibly fourth parts of this mini-series not being scheduled in until a few months from now. But if you'd like to stay updated for when we do release those, as well as when we put out new parts of this project, you can find all of our details on Twitter, Threads, Reddit, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me directly, I'm on the handle @MikeElliotOz. Oz is in Australia. I want to extend a massive thank you to this week's guest, Derek Basaccio, for all of his help on the project as a whole, and with his help on this episode. And in addition to Derek, I'd like to thank the entire Armed Forces and Redline team, who together have worked pretty tirelessly to pull together all the data and analysis for not only these scenarios, but the rest of the study as well, as this is all probably the most comprehensive study that has ever been done on this region and its military capabilities. And it's only been possible because of the amazing hard work and support of these teams. But with all that out the way, and nearly 3 hours of audio for me to now render, I'll wrap this episode up by saying the Redline will be back in a few weeks with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Redline podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.